Tonight, we're tracking a predator who mastered the art of vanishing. A killer who understood that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight, living ordinary lives while bodies pile up in the shadows. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story is darker than the last and the truth is more chilling than fiction. I truly appreciate you being here, but here's the thing. Not everyone is subscribing, liking, or commenting. These stories deserve more than silent views. Whether you're watching from New York, South Africa, Canada, the Philippines, the UK, or anywhere else, please hit subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below in the comments section. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great, thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts and goes a long way. For over 2 decades, South Los Angeles became his hunting ground, and the women who walked its streets became his prey. But this isn't just a story about a serial killer. This is about the invisible victims society chose to ignore, about a community that screamed for help while the world turned away, and about a monster who almost got away with it all. This is the story of the Grim Sleeper, the man who killed, paused, and killed again. I know you love falling asleep to these stories, and tonight you're in for something truly chilling. We'll be exploring 4 haunting true crime cases, each one darker than the last. So, get cozy, unwind, and let the day melt away. But before you drift off, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The summer of 1985 scorched Los Angeles with a heat that seemed to radiate not just from the sun, but from the very pavement itself. The city pulsed with an energy that could turn from vibrant to volatile in seconds. But in South Los Angeles, a different kind of heat was building. One that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what was happening to the women in the streets. August 10th, 1985, Deborah Jackson, 29 years old, left her apartment that evening wearing the kind of confidence that came from knowing these streets like the back of her hand. She'd grown up here. She knew which corners to avoid, which alleys stayed lit, which faces meant trouble. But knowledge doesn't always translate to safety, and that night, Deborah's familiarity with her neighborhood would mean nothing. Her body was discovered in an alley near 77th Street and Western Avenue. Someone had shot her 3 times, chest, back, and arm, before dumping her like garbage between dumpsters that reeked of rot and abandonment. But the bullets weren't the only violation. Her killer had sexually assaulted her, leaving DNA evidence that would eventually become crucial. For now, though, Deborah Jackson was just another statistic in a city that had seen too many murders to count. 3 weeks later, on August 12th, Henrietta Wright, 35, followed Deborah into the darkness. Her body materialized in an alley off 87th Street, arranged in an almost identical manner. Shot multiple times, sexually assaulted, discarded. The similarities screamed for attention, but South LA in the mid-80s wasn't the kind of neighborhood where police resources flowed freely. These weren't housewives from the suburbs. These were women involved in street-level prostitution, struggling with addiction, living on society's fringes. Women that the system had already written off. The pattern crystallized with sickening consistency. Barbara Ware, 23, disappeared on January 10th, 1987. Her body wouldn't surface until weeks later, dumped in an alley near Western Avenue like she'd never mattered at all. Shot, assaulted, abandoned. The killer was refining his method, understanding what worked, what didn't, how to move through the night like smoke. Then came Bernita Sparks, barely 26 years old, discovered in April 1987 in an alley between 2 abandoned buildings. Her killer had used the same caliber weapon, a .25 caliber handgun that was becoming his signature. The bullets weren't the dramatic, explosive rounds you see in movies. These were small, precise, efficient. The kind of gun that didn't draw attention, that fit easily into a pocket, that whispered instead of screamed. Mary Lowe's murder in November 1987 sent a darker message. At 26, she'd been fighting to get clean, trying to escape the life that had trapped her since her teens. Her family had seen progress. She'd been attending meetings, staying away from the corners where danger lurked. But addiction has hooks that dig deep, and one moment of weakness brought her back to the streets. Her body appeared in an alley near 93rd Street, violated and executed with the same cold efficiency as the others. The killer was escalating, growing bolder. Lacrica Jefferson was only 22 when she encountered him in January 1988. Her body joined the growing collection of discarded lives, found in yet another alley, shot with the same .25 caliber weapon, sexually assaulted in the same methodical manner. 7 victims in less than 3 years. 7 women who shared similar circumstances, similar vulnerabilities, similar fates. But here's what made this even more chilling. There were survivors. Women who escaped, who fought back, who lived to tell fragments of their stories. In November 1988, one woman climbed into a vehicle she thought was safe. The driver seemed normal, friendly, even. He took her to his house, and that's when everything changed. She described being sexually assaulted and shot, left for dead. But she survived, crawling from that place of horror with wounds that would scar both body and memory. Her description of the attacker and his vehicle should have been a breakthrough. Instead, it became another report filed away in an overwhelmed system. Alicia Alexander, only 18 years old, became the next confirmed victim in September 1988. Her youth made her murder feel even more predatory, more obscene. She'd barely lived, had barely experienced life beyond the harsh realities of the streets that had claimed her too soon. Her body told the same story as all the others. Small caliber gunshots, sexual assault, dumped in an alley like refuse. The killer was methodical, careful, and seemingly invisible. He targeted women he knew society wouldn't fight for, women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive manhunts or dominate news cycles. He understood something dark about the world, that not all victims are created equal in the public eye, that some deaths generate outrage while others barely generate a mention in the back pages of a newspaper. Princess Bertha Muir, 15 years old. Just 15. Her murder in March 1989 marked a new low in the killer's depravity. She was a child, regardless of her circumstances, regardless of the life she'd been forced into. Her body appeared near Western Avenue, another life erased by .25 caliber bullets and a man who had convinced himself that these women didn't matter. Valerie McCorvey, 35, found in July 1989. Henrietta Wright's case revisited, her body discovered months after she'd vanished. The heat of summer baked the alleys where these women were found, accelerating decomposition, making identification harder, allowing their killer more time to move freely through the city. By 1989, the body count was undeniable. The Los Angeles Police Department couldn't ignore the pattern anymore, couldn't dismiss these murders as random street violence. Someone was hunting women in South LA with calculated precision. Someone who understood police procedures well enough to avoid detection. Someone who knew these streets intimately, who blended into the neighborhood like camouflage. Detectives began mapping the murders, creating timelines, looking for connections. The victims all came from the same general area, all engaged in prostitution to support drug habits, all shot with the same type of weapon, all sexually assaulted. The killer's comfort zone emerged on paper, a roughly triangular area bounded by Western Avenue, Florence Avenue, and Figueroa Street, his hunting ground. But then something strange happened. After July 1989, the murders stopped. Completely. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, taking his secrets with him. The sudden silence was almost more disturbing than the violence had been. Where did he go? Why did he stop? Was he dead? Imprisoned for another crime? Had he moved to a different city, chosen new hunting grounds? The families of the victims weren't allowed the luxury of closure. They lived with questions that had no answers, with grief that never healed. They attended funerals in churches that had seen too many caskets, buried daughters and sisters and mothers in graves marked by headstones they could barely afford. They watched as the investigation grew cold, as leads dried up, as detectives moved on to fresher cases with better prospects. South LA continued its daily struggle. The crack epidemic raged through the streets like wildfire, destroying families, creating orphans, filling prisons. The violence continued, drive-by shootings and gang wars claiming lives with numbing regularity. And somewhere in this chaos, a serial killer had paused his reign of terror, waiting in silence for reasons no one understood. The neighborhood learned to live with ghosts. Women who walked these streets at night felt eyes on them that weren't there, heard footsteps that echoed their own, imagined every car that slowed down might contain the killer who'd claimed so many lives. Fear became as common as concrete, as present as the graffiti that marked territory and memorialized the dead. Parents held their daughters tighter, warned them about the dangers that lurked in shadows, and smiled from behind friendly faces. But poverty doesn't leave many choices. Addiction doesn't respond to warnings. The streets kept pulling women back, kept offering the only income available to those society had abandoned. And somewhere a killer waited. The media paid little attention. These weren't the kind of murders that generated headlines or sparked public outrage. There were no vigils covered by evening news cameras, no politicians calling for task forces, no community leaders demanding justice. South LA's pain remained local, contained, invisible to the rest of the city that existed just miles away but might as well have been on another planet. Detectives kept the files open but couldn't dedicate the resources needed for a proper investigation. There were too many murders, too few investigators, too little funding for a neighborhood that had been struggling long before these women started dying. The case files gathered dust, evidence sat in storage, and the killer remained free. Years passed. 1990, 1991, 1992. The city erupted in riots after the Rodney King verdict, and South LA burned with rage that had been building for decades. Through it all, the Grim Sleeper, a name he hadn't yet earned, remained silent. No new bodies appeared with his signature. No women came forward with similar stories of survival. It was as if he'd never existed, as if those 9 confirmed murders and countless attempted murders had been committed by a ghost who'd simply evaporated when the heat got too intense. But serial killers don't just stop. They can't. The urge that drives them to kill, the compulsion that makes them hunt, doesn't disappear. It might hibernate, might go dormant during times of stress or change, but it never truly dies. Somewhere in Los Angeles, the Grim Sleeper was waiting for his moment to return. 14 years of silence. 14 years during which the world changed in ways both profound and mundane. Technology advanced. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. The internet transformed how people communicated. But in South Los Angeles, the fundamental struggles remained the same. Poverty still trapped families in cycles of desperation. Addiction still claimed lives with merciless efficiency. And women still walked streets that had never stopped being dangerous. March 10, 2002. Ayala Marshall, the wrong side of her 40s, disappeared into the night like so many before her. But Ayala wasn't part of the original pattern. She'd been trying to rebuild her life, working legitimate jobs, staying away from the corners and alleys that had nearly destroyed her years earlier. Her body surfaced in an alley because where else would it be? But this time, something was different. Investigators had better tools, better techniques, better evidence collection methods. The bullets told a story. Small caliber, consistent with a .25 caliber handgun. The placement of wounds suggested someone who knew what they were doing, who'd done this before. The sexual assault followed a pattern that seemed hauntingly familiar to the few detectives who remembered cases from the 1980s. Could it be possible? Could the same killer from 14 years ago have returned? But one body doesn't establish a pattern, and without concrete connections to the old cases, Ayala's murder remained isolated. The investigation proceeded like countless others in South LA. Interviews with people who'd seen nothing, forensic evidence that pointed nowhere, leads that evaporated like morning fog. The file went cold, joining the thousands of other unsolved homicides that haunted LAPD storage facilities. The killer had tested the waters and found them warm. Whatever had forced him into dormancy, fear of capture, imprisonment for another crime, personal circumstances that removed opportunity, no longer applied. He'd successfully killed again after a 14-year break and walked away clean. The confidence that must have given him would prove intoxicating. January 1st, 2003. Janicia Peters, 25 years old, became the next victim as the new year dawned with blood instead of hope. Her body appeared in an alley off Western Avenue, the same hunting ground from the 80s, the same territory the killer knew like his own reflection. Shot with a small caliber weapon, sexually assaulted, dumped without ceremony or remorse. The similarities were impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention, but South LA homicides rarely received the scrutiny they deserve. July 11, 2003, 6 months after Janicia, the body of an unidentified woman materialized in yet another alley, her identity lost to the streets that had claimed her life. No fingerprints on file. No one came forward to identify her. No one reported her missing. She became a Jane Doe, buried without a name, mourned by no one except perhaps the overworked detectives who'd failed to save her. The killer was accelerating again, rediscovering his rhythm, remembering the dark joy his crimes had once brought him. The pattern from the 80s had returned with disturbing precision. Same neighborhood, same victim profile, same weapon, same disposal method. But now, 2 decades into the evolution of forensic science, the killer was leaving behind more than just bodies. He was leaving DNA evidence that could be collected, analyzed, and compared. The technology that would eventually bring him down was advancing faster than he could adapt. 2005 brought another horror. A woman's body found in July, shot and sexually assaulted, dumped in the industrial wasteland near Western Avenue, where homeless encampments mixed with abandoned warehouses. The killer's comfort zone hadn't shifted an inch in 20 years. He knew these streets, understood their rhythms, could navigate them blindfolded. This was his territory, marked not with graffiti but with graves. 2006. Another victim. Then 2007 brought yet another body, another life erased, another family destroyed. The kills were coming more frequently now, the gaps between murders shrinking. The dormancy had ended, and the grim sleeper, though still unnamed in official reports, was making up for lost time. But here's where the story takes a turn toward the obsessive. Detective Dennis Kilcoyne, a veteran of the LAPD's robbery-homicide division, couldn't let go of the cases. Something about the pattern gnawed at him, kept him awake at night, pulled him back to the evidence even when his superiors suggested he focus on more solvable crimes. Kilcoyne started connecting dots that others had missed or dismissed. He pulled files from the 80s, compared them to the recent murders, and found undeniable similarities. The victim profiles matched almost exactly women of color involved in prostitution, struggling with addiction, living on society's margins. The weapon was consistent .25 caliber handgun fired at close range. The disposal method never varied. Alleys in the same geographic area, bodies positioned similarly, no attempt to hide them completely. This wasn't random street violence. This was serial murder spanning 2 decades. Kilcoyne's breakthrough came when he started focusing on the DNA evidence. Samples from the recent crimes could be compared to samples from the 80s. If they matched, it would prove beyond doubt that the same killer was responsible for murders 20 years apart. But DNA analysis takes time, requires funding, demands bureaucratic approval. Kilcoyne pushed through every obstacle, calling in favors, making himself unbearable to supervisors who just wanted him to move on. The results came back with devastating clarity. The DNA matched. The same man who'd terrorized South LA in the 80s had returned after a 14-year hiatus. The same killer who'd murdered at least 9 women before going silent had resumed his hunting with the same methodical precision. The case wasn't just unsolved, it was active, immediate, urgent. But identifying a pattern doesn't mean identifying a killer. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the criminal database. Whoever this monster was, he'd never been arrested for a serious enough crime to require DNA collection, or he'd committed his crimes before such databases existed. The profile sat in storage, waiting for a match that seemed like it might never come. The case gained a name around this time, though not through official channels. Someone, maybe a detective, maybe a reporter, maybe just someone who'd been tracking the murders, started calling him the Grim Sleeper. The name captured the essence of his pattern perfectly. Grim murders followed by a long sleep, then a grim awakening. The name stuck, spreading through the community like a curse, giving form to the fear that had haunted South LA for decades. Kilcoyne became obsessed. He created timelines, mapped locations, interviewed hundreds of people who might have seen something, anything that could lead to the killer. He dove into the victims' lives, not to judge them but to understand them, to see patterns in their final days that might reveal their killer's identity. He spoke with families who'd been waiting 20 years for answers, looked into eyes that had long ago given up hope of justice. The investigation revealed something darker than just the murders themselves. It exposed how society had failed these women long before their killer found them. They'd grown up in neighborhoods starved of resources, attended schools that couldn't provide adequate education, faced employment discrimination that closed legitimate paths to success. Poverty had pushed them toward the streets. Addiction had kept them there. And the system that should have protected them had instead abandoned them to a predator who understood exactly how invisible they'd become. Witnesses emerged slowly, hesitantly. Women who'd survived encounters with a man matching the killer's description started coming forward, though their stories had been dismissed years earlier. One woman described being picked up near Western Avenue by a friendly man in an orange Ford Pinto. He'd taken her to his house. She couldn't remember the exact address but knew it was nearby, where he'd sexually assaulted her and shot her. She'd survived by playing dead, waiting until he left the room before fleeing into the night, bleeding and traumatized. Another survivor told a similar story. The friendly approach. The car, always a car that wouldn't stand out, wouldn't be remembered. The house nearby, comfortable enough to suggest someone who lived there permanently. Not a cracked den or abandoned building. The assault, the gunshot, the miraculous survival. These women had tried to report their attacks, but their histories of addiction and prostitution had made them seem unreliable. Their stories had been filed away, considered dubious, forgotten. Kilcoyne listened differently. He heard the consistency in their accounts, the details that aligned too perfectly to be fabrication. He understood what other investigators hadn't. These women were survivors of the same predator who'd killed all the others. They'd simply been lucky or strong or stubborn enough to live through their encounters. Their stories weren't just testimonials. They were maps leading toward the killer's identity. The house. That detail kept recurring. The killer had a house in South LA, somewhere within his hunting ground. He was comfortable taking victims there, which meant he either lived alone or had enough privacy to commit his crimes without neighbors noticing. The Ford Pinto, distinctive because of its orange color, had appeared in multiple accounts. These weren't random attacks in alleyways. The killer was luring women to his home, assaulting them there, shooting them there, then transporting their bodies to dumping sites. This changed everything. The killer wasn't some transient predator moving through the area. He was a resident, someone who'd lived in South LA for decades, who'd raised his family there, who went to work every day and came home every night to a house where he'd murdered countless women. He was a neighbor, maybe someone people greeted on the street, someone who blended so perfectly into the community that he'd become invisible despite hiding in plain sight. The profile emerged piece by piece. African-American male, likely middle-aged or older given the timeline of murders stretching back to 1985. Lived in South LA, probably within the triangle formed by Western Avenue, Florence Avenue, and Figueroa Street. Owned or had long-term access to a residence where he could commit his crimes. Employed, probably in a job that gave him flexibility in his hours or access to a vehicle. Someone who understood the streets, knew the women who walked them, could approach them without triggering immediate suspicion. But knowing the profile and finding the man were entirely different challenges. South LA contained thousands of people who fit that general description. Without a name, without a specific address, without something concrete to focus the investigation, Kilcoyne was searching for one specific predator in a sea of possibilities. Then came the break that would change everything. California had implemented a new program designed to solve exactly these kinds of cold cases: familial DNA searching. The concept was revolutionary and controversial in equal measure. If the killer's DNA wasn't in the database, maybe a relative's was. Parents, children, siblings, any close family member would share enough genetic markers to show up as a partial match in the database. The search hit gold. A partial match appeared, linking the Grim Sleeper's DNA to a man who'd been arrested for a felony weapons charge. That man had a father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., resident of South Los Angeles, living on 81st Street right in the heart of the Grim Sleeper's hunting ground. 81st Street looked like 10,000 other residential streets in South Los Angeles. Small houses crammed together, chain-link fences separating tiny yards, cars parked along curbs in various states of repair. This was a working-class neighborhood where people kept their heads down, worked hard, and tried to ignore the dysfunction that occasionally erupted around them. Nothing about 81st Street screamed serial killer. Everything about it whispered ordinary. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. had lived at 1728 West 81st Street for decades. He was born on August 30th, 1952, making him 33 when the murders started in 1985 and 57 when they resumed in 2002. He'd served in the United States Army, working as a mechanic, learning skills that would later provide legitimate employment. After his service, he'd returned to Los Angeles, married, had children, established himself as a mechanic specializing in vehicles and air conditioning repair. By all external appearances, Franklin was normal, boring even. He worked on cars in his garage, chatted with neighbors, attended family gatherings. He wasn't the neighborhood weirdo that everyone whispered about. He wasn't the obvious suspect with the strange eyes and predatory demeanor. He was just Lonnie, the guy who could fix your air conditioner when summer turned the city into an oven, who'd give you a fair price and do good work. But normality is often a mask, and Franklin's was impenetrable. Behind the facade of the friendly mechanic lived something else entirely. A predator who'd refined his hunting over decades, who'd learned exactly how to select victims society wouldn't fight for, who'd mastered the art of appearing harmless while being anything but. Detective Kilcoyne and his team began surveillance in July 2010. They watched Franklin's house, tracked his movements, documented his routines. They needed more than familial DNA to make an arrest that would stick. They needed direct evidence, something that would place Franklin at the crimes beyond any doubt. And they needed it without tipping him off that he'd finally been identified after 25 years of freedom. The surveillance revealed patterns. Franklin kept unusual hours, often leaving his house late at night and returning in the early morning. He drove various vehicles. He was a mechanic, so this made sense. But investigators noted an orange Ford Pinto in his possession, tucked away in his garage like a relic from another era. The same distinctive vehicle multiple survivors had described. July 7, 2010. The surveillance team watched as Franklin left his house and walked down the street. This was their moment. An undercover officer approached him, posing as a restaurant server offering free samples of pizza. Franklin accepted, ate the pizza, tossed the plate and napkin in a public trash can. The officer retrieved it immediately, carefully preserving the DNA Franklin had left behind on the items he'd touched with his mouth. The samples went to the lab for analysis. Days of agonizing waiting followed while technicians extracted DNA and compared it to the profile from the crime scenes. The tension was unbearable. If the DNA didn't match, if there'd been a mistake in the familial search, if somehow they'd focused on the wrong person, then the Grim Sleeper would remain free to kill again. The results came back definitive. Perfect match. The DNA on the pizza plate and napkin matched the DNA from the crime scenes spanning back to 1985. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was the Grim Sleeper. The monster they'd been hunting for a quarter century had been living openly in South LA the entire time, hiding behind the mask of normalcy, protected by his utter ordinariness. July 8, 2010. Armed with an arrest warrant and overwhelming evidence, LAPD officers descended on 1728 West 81st Street. Franklin was outside, working in his garage when they arrived. He showed no resistance, no surprise, no emotion at all. He simply allowed himself to be handcuffed, read his rights, placed in the back of a police car. His face revealed nothing. No guilt, no fear, no relief at finally being caught. Just blank acceptance, as if he'd always known this day would come. The search of Franklin's house revealed horrors that would haunt investigators for years. In his garage, hidden among tools and car parts and normal mechanical equipment, They found a collection that told the real story of who Lonnie Franklin Jr. actually was. Photographs. Hundreds of photographs. Maybe thousands. Images of women in various states of consciousness, posed in ways that suggested they'd been drugged or unconscious when the photos were taken. Many of the women in the photographs were still alive, had no idea Franklin had drugged and photographed them. They'd encountered him, accepted a ride or a drink, and lost time. Waking up confused, feeling violated but unable to remember exactly what had happened. Now those missing hours materialized in the form of photographs showing them unconscious, posed, violated. The psychological trauma of discovering these images would devastate dozens of women who thought they'd simply had too much to drink or taken drugs that hit harder than expected. But other photographs showed women who would never see these images. Women who'd been murdered, their bodies found in alleys throughout South LA. Franklin had documented his crimes, created a catalog of his victims, preserved memories of his actions like someone might preserve vacation photos. The narcissism was stunning. He'd risked keeping evidence that could destroy him because he couldn't bear to let go of the memories, couldn't resist the urge to revisit his crimes through these frozen moments. Among the evidence, investigators found the gun, a .25 caliber handgun that ballistics would later match to the bullets recovered from multiple victims. He'd kept it all these years, probably used it for the recent murders after his 14-year hiatus. The weapon that had ended so many lives sat in his garage like any other tool, cleaned and maintained, ready for use. They found personal items belonging to victims, jewelry, identification, clothing. These were trophies, tokens Franklin had taken to remember the women he'd killed. Each item represented a life erased, a family destroyed, a person reduced to a souvenir in a serial killer's collection. The neighborhood reacted with stunned disbelief. People who'd known Franklin for years, who'd hired him to fix their cars, who'd exchanged pleasantries with him on the street, couldn't reconcile the friendly mechanic with the monster who'd terrorized their community. But that disbelief slowly transformed into horror as they realized what his normalcy actually meant. The killer hadn't been some outside threat, some obviously dangerous stranger. He'd been one of them, living among them, hiding behind the most effective disguise possible, the appearance of being completely ordinary. Franklin's family fell apart under the weight of revelation. His wife, married to him for decades, claimed she'd had no idea. How could she? How do you sleep next to someone for years without knowing they're a serial killer? But investigators found it hard to believe she'd been completely ignorant. The photographs alone numbered in the hundreds. The comings and goings at odd hours. The bodies piling up within blocks of their house. Could someone really be that oblivious? Or was willful blindness easier than facing the truth? His children grappled with the impossible task of reconciling their father with his crimes. The man who'd raised them attended their school functions, taught them skills, celebrated holidays with them. That man was also a serial killer who'd murdered at least 10 women and probably many more. The psychological damage of that realization would echo through generations of Franklin's family. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives revisited every unsolved murder of a woman in South LA from 1985 onward. They compared evidence from dozens of cold cases to Franklin's DNA, looking for connections. They interviewed hundreds of women who'd survived encounters with him, women who'd been photographed while unconscious, women who'd escaped his house, women who'd always suspected something was wrong but had never been believed. The victim count climbed. 10 confirmed murders became the official number, but investigators suspected the real total was much higher. Some bodies had never been found. Some murders had been attributed to other causes. Some women had simply vanished, becoming missing persons cases that never received serious investigation. Franklin's killing career had spanned at least 25 years, maybe longer. 10 confirmed victims felt like a fraction of the truth. The question that haunted everyone was simple but unanswerable. Why did he stop for 14 years? What happened between 1989 and 2002 that halted his killing? Investigators looked for explanations. Had he been imprisoned for another crime? No record of that existed. Had he moved away from Los Angeles? No evidence suggested it. Had some personal crisis interrupted his killing? His wife couldn't or wouldn't provide insights. The most likely explanation was simultaneously the most disturbing. Franklin had stopped because the heat got too intense. By 1989, despite the limited investigation, despite the lack of media coverage, despite the general disregard for his victims, enough attention had focused on the murders that Franklin felt unsafe continuing. So he'd simply paused, gone dormant like a virus waiting for the immune response to weaken. He'd lived his normal life, worked his normal job, maintained his normal relationships, all while the urge to kill festered inside him, controlled but never eliminated. When enough time had passed, when he felt the danger had diminished, when he believed the cases had gone cold enough that no one was still actively looking, he'd started again. The first kill in 2002 was a test. When nothing happened, when he wasn't immediately identified and arrested, his confidence returned. The subsequent murders followed the same pattern as before because Franklin had learned long ago that his method worked. Why change what had been successful for years? The trial preparation revealed the bureaucratic failures that had allowed Franklin to kill for so long. DNA evidence from the 80s had been stored poorly or lost entirely. Witness statements from survivors had been dismissed or inadequately followed up. The victims' marginalized status had meant their cases received minimal resources. The geographic clustering of murders should have triggered more aggressive investigation but hadn't because South LA was drowning in violence and these murders had seemed like just more of the same. The systemic racism and classism that had enabled Franklin's crimes couldn't be denied. If these had been murders of middle-class white women in wealthy neighborhoods, the response would have been immediate and overwhelming. But Franklin had chosen victims from a community society had already abandoned. He'd understood, consciously or not, that he could kill with impunity as long as his victims came from the right, or rather, the wrong demographic. The photographs haunted investigators more than almost anything else. They showed women completely vulnerable, unconscious, unaware they were being documented. Some were clearly in Franklin's garage, identifiable by the tools and equipment visible in the background. Others were in different locations, suggesting Franklin had attacked women in various places, not just at his house. The sheer number of photographs implied that many of his attacks hadn't resulted in murder. He'd assaulted women, photographed them, and released them without killing them. These women would live the rest of their lives not knowing what had been done to them while they were unconscious. As the case built toward trial, Franklin remained eerily calm. He showed no remorse, no emotional response to the evidence mounted against him. Detectives who interviewed him described talking to a void, a person who simply didn't process guilt or shame the way normal humans do. He didn't confess but didn't deny anything either. He simply existed in silence, as if the lives he'd destroyed were too insignificant to warrant discussion. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and in Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s case, they turned with agonizing deliberation. The arraignment took place in July 2010, just days after his arrest. Franklin stood in court wearing orange jail scrubs, his expression blank, his demeanor unchanged from the moment of his arrest. The charges read like a litany of horror. 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, dozens of counts of sexual assault. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty. The preliminary hearings stretched across months, each session revealing new horrors. Evidence was presented methodically: DNA matches, ballistic analyses, victim testimonies from survivors, the photographs that had documented Franklin's crimes. The defense tried to challenge the familial DNA evidence that had first identified Franklin, arguing that the technique was too new, too unreliable, too invasive. But the direct DNA match from the pizza plate eliminated any doubt. The familial search had simply pointed investigators toward Franklin. His own DNA had condemned him. Survivors testified with courage that few people possess. Women took the stand and described being picked up by Franklin, accepting rides in his various vehicles, being taken to his house on 81st Street. They described drinks that tasted strange, sudden drowsiness, consciousness fading. They described waking up in pain, knowing they'd been violated but unable to remember details, finding themselves dumped in alleys or on unfamiliar streets. They described being shot, playing dead, surviving through sheer will and luck. One survivor's testimony particularly moved the courtroom. She described Franklin approaching her near Western Avenue in 1988, offering her a ride, seeming friendly and safe. She'd gotten into his vehicle, not the orange Pinto but a different car he'd had access to. He'd taken her to his house, offered her a drink. The next clear memory she had was waking up on the floor of his garage, pain radiating through her chest and back. She'd been shot multiple times. Franklin had apparently left the garage, believing her dead. She'd crawled to the door, made it outside, flagged down help. Her survival had been miraculous. Her report to police at the time had been filed away, treated as just another South LA shooting, not connected to the series of murders despite the obvious similarities. She'd lived with nightmares for 22 years before learning that her attacker had finally been caught. The relief in her voice was palpable, but so was the anger. 22 years he walked free, she said, staring directly at Franklin. 22 years I looked over my shoulder, wondering if he'd come back to finish what he started. 22 years of wondering why I survived when others didn't. Franklin never looked at her. He sat at the defense table, stone-faced, as if her testimony was happening to someone else, about someone else. His detachment was chilling. This wasn't a man wrestling with guilt or shame. This was someone who fundamentally didn't view his victims as human beings worthy of consideration. The families of the murdered women filled the courtroom day after day. Mothers who'd buried daughters, sisters who'd lost siblings, children who'd grown up without their mothers. They sat through testimony that detailed exactly how their loved ones had died, how they'd suffered, how they'd been discarded. The pain in that courtroom was thick enough to choke on, but still Franklin showed nothing. No remorse, no acknowledgement, nothing. Laverne Peters, mother of Janicia Peters who'd been murdered on New Year's Day 2003, gave a victim impact statement that left hardened detectives wiping away tears. She described Janicia as a child, bright, curious, full of life. She described watching addiction take hold during her teenage years, watching her daughter slip away despite every intervention, every treatment program, every desperate attempt to save her. She described the phone call that shattered what remained of her world, the moment when police informed her that Janicia's body had been found in an alley. "My daughter had struggles," Laverne said, her voice cracking but remaining strong. "She made mistakes. She fought demons I couldn't understand. But she was still my baby. She was still a human being who deserved to live, who deserved a chance to get better, who deserved to grow old. That man took that from her. He took her from me. And for what? Because he could? Because he enjoyed it? Because women like my daughter didn't matter to anyone." The prosecution built its case with meticulous care. They presented the timeline of murders, showing the clear pattern in the 80s, the sudden stop, the resumption in 2002. They presented the DNA evidence that irrefutably linked Franklin to the crimes. They presented ballistic evidence showing that the same gun had been used across multiple murders spanning 2 decades. They presented testimony from forensic experts, detectives, surviving victims. They presented the photographs found in Franklin's garage, hundreds of images that documented his predation. The photographs became the most damaging evidence. Even though many showed women who'd survived their encounters with Franklin, the images revealed his method, his planning, his utter disregard for his victims' humanity. Women were posed like dolls, unconscious and unaware, reduced to objects for Franklin's gratification. The prosecution argued that these photographs showed premeditation, showed that Franklin had refined his technique over years, shown that he'd created a systematic method for drugging, assaulting, and often killing vulnerable women. The defense strategy was limited by the overwhelming evidence. They couldn't deny that Franklin had killed these women. The DNA made denial impossible. Instead, they tried to avoid the death penalty by arguing mitigating factors. They presented Franklin's military service, his lack of prior violent convictions, his stable employment history. They tried to paint him as someone who'd lived a mostly normal life except for these crimes, as if decades of serial murder could be compartmentalized away from the rest of his existence. The argument fell flat. The jury saw through it immediately. Franklin's normalcy wasn't a mitigating factor, it was an aggravating one. He'd proven that he could function in society, hold down a job, maintain relationships, appear completely ordinary, all while systematically hunting and killing women. That made him more dangerous, not less. It proved that his crimes weren't the result of mental illness or inability to control himself. They were choices made repeatedly over 25 years with full understanding of what he was doing. The trial itself didn't begin until 2016, 6 years after Franklin's arrest. 6 years during which he sat in jail, the evidence against him mounted, and families waited for closure that seemed perpetually delayed. The delays came from legal maneuvering, changes in defense attorneys, challenges to evidence, the sheer complexity of prosecuting someone for crimes spanning multiple decades. Every delay was agony for the victims' families. Every postponement another reminder that their loved ones' cases had never been priorities. When the trial finally began, it lasted for months. The prosecution called over 70 witnesses. They presented thousands of pieces of evidence. They walked the jury through Franklin's hunting ground, showed them maps of where bodies had been found, demonstrated the geographic consistency that proved these weren't random crimes. They presented timeline after timeline, connecting Franklin's movements to the times and locations where women disappeared. The defense called few witnesses. What could they say? The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they focused on cross-examination, trying to create doubt about the forensic evidence, suggesting that contamination might have occurred, arguing that the familial DNA search had been a violation of Franklin's rights. But none of it mattered. The pizza plate DNA had been collected legally and matched perfectly to crime scene evidence. No amount of legal maneuvering could erase that fact. Franklin never testified in his own defense. He sat silently throughout the trial, occasionally whispering to his attorneys but never showing emotion, never reacting to the testimony of survivors or the grief of victims' families. His silence was strategic but also revealing. There was nothing he could say that would help his case, no explanation that would make sense, no remorse that would seem genuine. Silence was his only option. The closing arguments laid bare the magnitude of Franklin's crimes. The prosecution spoke for hours, detailing each victim's life, each family's loss, each survivor's trauma. They showed the jury photographs of the victims when they were alive. Deborah Jackson smiling at a family gathering, Henrietta Wright holding a niece, Princess Bertha Muir in her school photo looking impossibly young and vulnerable. They forced the jury to see these women as human beings, not just names on a list, not just bodies in alleys. Lonnie Franklin Jr. hunted vulnerable women for 25 years, the prosecutor said in his closing statement. He chose victims he believed society wouldn't care about, wouldn't fight for, wouldn't remember. He was almost right. For years, these women's murders went unsolved not because the cases were too hard to crack, but because no one cared enough to try. But we're here now. These women's families never stopped caring. Justice may have been delayed, but it will not be denied. The defense's closing argument tried one last time to humanize Franklin, to present him as something other than a monster. They spoke about his service in the army, his work as a mechanic, his role as a father and husband. But the jury had seen the photographs, had heard the survivors' testimonies, had learned about the women whose lives Franklin had stolen. No amount of spin could transform him into anything but what he was, a serial killer who'd preyed on the vulnerable for decades. May 5, 2016. After deliberating for less than 2 days, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all counts. 10 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, multiple counts of sexual assault. The courtroom erupted in tears and relief. Families who'd waited 27 years for justice finally heard the words they'd almost given up hoping for. Guilty. Franklin's expression didn't change. He stood as the verdicts were read, showing the same blank detachment he'd displayed throughout the trial. Even now, facing the rest of his life in prison or possibly execution, he couldn't muster a human response. The mask never slipped because there was nothing underneath it, just emptiness where empathy and conscience should have been. The penalty phase began immediately. The same jury that had convicted Franklin now had to decide whether he should receive life in prison without possibility of parole or the death penalty. The prosecution argued for death, citing the number of victims, the decades-long span of crimes, the utter lack of remorse. The defense argued for life, presenting the same mitigation factors they'd used during the guilt phase, adding that Franklin was now in his 60s and posed no future threat while incarcerated. The jury deliberated for several days on the penalty. This was a heavier decision than the guilty verdict, deciding whether another human being should live or die, even a human being who'd shown such contempt for life. On August 10, 2016, 31 years to the day after Deborah Jackson's murder, the jury returned with their decision, death. Franklin was formally sentenced to death on August 10, 2016. Judge Kathleen Kennedy read the sentence in a packed courtroom, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything these cases represented. The defendant has shown a complete and utter lack of remorse for his actions, she said. He has destroyed families, traumatized survivors, and terrorized an entire community for decades. The only just punishment is death. But California's death penalty exists more in theory than practice. The state has executed only 13 people since 1976, and the appeals process for death row inmates stretches for decades. Franklin would likely die of natural causes long before the state could execute him. Still, the symbolism mattered. Society had finally acknowledged these women's worth, had finally declared that their lives mattered, that their deaths demanded the ultimate sanction. The investigation didn't end with Franklin's conviction. Detectives continued working through the hundreds of photographs found in his garage, trying to identify women who might have been victims of assaults they never knew about. They reached out to women across Los Angeles, asking them if they'd ever encountered Franklin, ever accepted a ride from him, ever lost time in ways they couldn't explain. Dozens more women came forward with stories of suspicious encounters, drugged drinks, missing hours, waking up feeling violated but unable to remember why. The true scope of Franklin's crimes may never be fully known. 10 confirmed murders, 1 confirmed attempted murder. But how many more women did he assault and photograph but not kill? How many women disappeared whose bodies were never found? How many deaths were attributed to other causes because no one was looking for connections? Investigators believe Franklin's actual victim count could be 30, 40, possibly even 50 women across his decades of predation. In March 2020, Franklin's story ended not with execution but with a different kind of death. He was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. Prison officials attempted resuscitation, but Franklin died shortly after, apparently from natural causes. He was 67 years old. He'd spent less than 10 years in prison for crimes spanning 25 years. His death sparked complicated reactions. Some of his victims' families felt robbed of watching him die by execution, of having closure through the formal completion of his sentence. Others felt relief that he was finally gone, regardless of how it happened. Some felt nothing at all. Franklin had already taken so much from them that his death couldn't add or subtract anything meaningful. The legacy of the grim sleeper case extends far beyond Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s crimes. It exposed systematic failures in how law enforcement handles cases involving marginalized victims. It revealed how societal biases about who deserves protection and justice can enable predators to operate with impunity for decades. It demonstrated how women of color, especially those struggling with poverty and addiction, are treated as disposable by systems that should protect them equally. South Los Angeles still carries the scars. Families still mourn. Survivors still struggle with trauma that will never fully heal. The alleys where bodies were found look the same as they always did, but now they're marked by invisible memorials. Spaces where lives ended, where evil triumphed for too long, where justice came too late for too many. The house on 81st Street still stands, though Franklin's family has long since abandoned it. Neighbors avoid looking at it directly, as if acknowledging its existence might somehow contaminate them with the horror that occurred there. It's become a haunted place without ghosts, empty of spirits but full of the weight of everything that happened within its walls. The women Franklin killed deserved better than the lives they lived and the deaths they suffered. They deserved opportunities that poverty denied them. They deserved treatment for the addictions that trapped them. They deserved police protection that society withheld from them. They deserved to be mourned immediately and thoroughly when they died, not to have their cases go cold for decades while their killer walked free. Their names should be remembered, spoken aloud, honored. Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lacrica Jefferson, Alicia Alexander, Princess Bertha Muir, Valerie McCorvey, Ella Marshall, Janicia Peters, the unnamed Jane Does whose identities were lost. These weren't just victims of a serial killer. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, human beings whose lives mattered, whose deaths demanded justice, whose memories deserve preservation. The Grim Sleeper hunted for 25 years, hiding behind normalcy, protected by society's indifference toward his chosen victims. He almost got away with it all. In some ways, he did. He died before the state could execute him, before he could spend enough years in prison to truly pay for his crimes. But he didn't get away with anonymity. The world knows who Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was and what he did. The world knows the names of the women he killed. And the world knows that systems failed, that biases enabled, that justice delayed was justice partially denied. As we close this chapter on one of Los Angeles's most horrific serial killers, we're left with uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. How many other predators are operating right now, enabled by society's indifference toward vulnerable populations? How many women are dying in circumstances written off as unremarkable because of who they are and where they live? How many families are waiting for justice that will never come because their loved ones don't fit the profile of perfect victims? The Grim Sleeper's story is over, but the issues it exposed remain as urgent as ever. Every life has value. Every death deserves investigation. Every victim deserves justice, regardless of their circumstances, their struggles, their place in society's hierarchy. Until we truly embrace these principles, until we allocate resources and attention equally across all communities, the next Lonnie Franklin Jr. is already out there, hunting in the shadows, counting on our continued indifference to protect him. Sleep uneasy tonight, knowing that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like mechanics and neighbors and ordinary people living ordinary lives. They hide behind normalcy, blend into communities, bank on society's prejudices to provide cover for their crimes. The Grim Sleeper taught us that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who stand out. They're the ones who disappear into the background, becoming invisible precisely because they look like everyone else. And somewhere in America tonight, another predator is making that same calculation. Choosing victims from population society has already abandoned, counting on our continued failure to care about all lives equally. The Grim Sleeper is dead, but the systemic failures that enabled him to kill for 25 years are very much alive. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, Randy Stephen Kraft, the Scorecard Killer. Some killers leave bodies. This one kept score. For 16 years, a predator moved through the California night like smoke, hunting along darkened highways where the desperate and the careless disappeared without witness. He was a computer consultant by day, brilliant, organized, meticulous. By night, he transformed into something that defied comprehension, a collector of human suffering who documented each kill with the casual efficiency of a grocery list. 67 cryptic entries. 67 lives reduced to coded abbreviations in a spiral notebook tucked inside a Toyota Celica. Tonight, we're tracking the monster who turned murder into a filing system, who smiled at police officers with blood still wet under his fingernails, who made Southern California's freeways his personal hunting ground. This is the story of Randy Stephen Kraft, the man who almost got away with being America's most prolific serial killer, and the random traffic stop that finally dragged him into the light. His victims trusted him. That was their fatal mistake. The darkness along Interstate 5 swallows everything. Streetlights appear and vanish like dying stars, casting brief halos of sodium yellow light before surrendering again to the absolute black of Southern California's arterial highways. It's here, in these rivers of asphalt cutting through the sprawling empire of strip malls and military bases, that people vanish. Not all at once, not in ways that trigger immediate alarm, but slowly, steadily, with the methodical patience of something that has learned to feed without drawing attention. May 14, 1983, two California Highway Patrol officers, Michael Howard and Michael Sterling, rolled through the pre-dawn hours along the San Diego freeway near Mission Viejo. Their shift was winding down, that dangerous hour when exhaustion makes the mind wander, when even trained observers can miss the critical detail. But something caught Sterling's attention. A Toyota Celica drifting across lane markers with the lazy imprecision of a drunk driver. Standard traffic stop. Routine procedure. They lit up the vehicle and pulled it over at 1:43 a.m. What happened next would peel back the curtain on one of America's most grotesque killing sprees. The Celica's door opened and out stepped a man who looked like he'd just left a computer lab or a faculty meeting. Randy Stephen Kraft, 38 years old, wore wire-rimmed glasses and a calm expression that suggested mild annoyance rather than panic. He was articulate, cooperative, almost friendly. The officers smelled beer on his breath, enough to justify the stop, but nothing that screamed danger. Kraft explained he'd been drinking with a friend, that everything was fine, that he was heading home. His words came smooth and practiced, the patter of someone who'd talked his way through checkpoints before. Then Officer Sterling glanced into the passenger seat. A young man sat slumped against the door, head tilted at an angle that didn't look like sleep. His arm hung limp, fingers slightly curled. Sterling called out to him. No response. He opened the passenger door and the body nearly fell into his arms. The skin was already cooling, already taking on the waxy texture of recent death. Terry Lee Gambrill, a 25-year-old Marine from Camp Pendleton, had been dead for perhaps an hour, maybe less. His pants were pulled down around his ankles. Ligature marks ringed his neck. His body bore the unmistakable signatures of torture, marks that suggested prolonged suffering, careful attention to the art of inflicting pain. Randy Kraft stood by his vehicle, still calm, still wearing that same expression of mild inconvenience, as if the corpse in his passenger seat was nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. The officers searched the vehicle with the kind of creeping dread that comes when routine transforms into nightmare. What they found inside that Toyota Celica would keep detectives awake for years. In the back seat, they discovered clothing that didn't belong to Kraft. Photographs, dozens of them, showing young men in various states of undress, unconsciousness, and death. Some appeared drugged, their eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Others looked posed, arranged like mannequins for Kraft's personal gallery. Each image was a trophy, a moment of absolute control frozen in Kodak emulsion. But the most chilling discovery sat in the car's console. A small spiral notebook, unremarkable in appearance, containing a list written in neat handwriting. 67 entries total. Cryptic abbreviations like Marine Carson, Portland Blood, 2IN 1 Hitch, What You Got, and Stabbed Genitals. Each entry corresponded, investigators would later determine, to a separate victim, a human being reduced to a coded phrase in a killer's ledger. Some entries they would eventually identify. Many remain mysteries to this day, their owners lost to time and Kraft's meticulous discretion. The scorecard killer had been stopped not by brilliant detective work or psychological profiling, but by two patrol officers noticing a car drifting across painted lines. Pure chance. Random luck. The only thing standing between Randy Kraft and dozens more victims was the wandering attention of a highway patrol officer at the end of a long shift. Born March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California, Randy Stephen Kraft arrived during that strange post-war bloom of American optimism, when returning soldiers filled suburban houses with children and dreams of manufactured normalcy. His parents were decent, unremarkable people. His childhood was, by most accounts, ordinary. He was intelligent, exceptionally so, earning strong grades without apparent effort. He joined the Air Force after high school, served his time, received an honorable discharge. He attended community college, then Claremont Men's College, eventually graduating with a degree in economics. He was openly gay in an era when that required courage, living with his longtime partner Jeff Seelig in a tidy house in Long Beach. To neighbors, co-workers, and casual acquaintances, Randy Kraft was utterly normal, boring even. He worked as a computer consultant, debugging systems and managing data with the same meticulous attention he would later apply to murder. He had friends. He attended social gatherings. He was articulate, educated, funny in the dry way that technical people often are. Nothing in his presentation suggested the abyss that existed behind his eyes, but there were cracks in the facade. Small ones at first. Witnesses would later recall moments that, in retrospect, carried weight. A certain coldness in his humor, a fascination with control and humiliation, an ability to drink heavily without ever seeming truly drunk. He frequented gay bars along the California coast, places where young servicemen and hitchhikers mingled with locals, where loneliness and opportunity intersected. These were his hunting grounds, the theaters where he performed his careful rituals of seduction and slaughter. The pattern was always similar. He would target young men, usually between 18 and 25, usually connected to the military or hitchhiking along the coastal highways. He offered rides, drinks, companionship. He was charming when he needed to be, patient in ways that disarmed suspicion. His victims were often vulnerable, broke, far from home, looking for connection or just a safe ride to the next town. Kraft provided what they needed right up until the moment he didn't. Once he had them isolated, in his car, in a motel room, in some forgotten stretch of beach accessible only by dirt roads, the real Randy Kraft emerged. He would drug them, using combinations of alcohol and sedatives that rendered them compliant but not immediately unconscious. He wanted them aware, at least initially. He wanted them to understand what was happening. The torture that followed was not frenzied or chaotic. It was methodical, almost clinical. He used ligatures, knives, foreign objects. He documented the process with photographs, capturing their deterioration from human being to object. When he was finished, when they had served their purpose, he would strangle them, usually manually, feeling their life expire against his hands. Then came disposal. Kraft dumped bodies along highways, in trash bins, off remote fire roads. He rarely tried to hide them beyond the immediate moment. He didn't need to. Bodies of drifters and servicemen don't always generate intensive investigations. Many of his victims went unidentified for years. Some still are. They became John Does in coroner's reports, forgotten faces in missing persons databases, statistical anomalies rather than urgent cases. Between 1971 and 1983, Randy Kraft killed with near impunity. He moved between California, Oregon, and Michigan, expanding his territory like a business opening new franchises. Law enforcement agencies worked in silos, rarely communicating across jurisdictions. DNA analysis didn't exist. Criminal profiling was still in its infancy. For a killer as organized and intelligent as Kraft, the landscape was nearly perfect. He could hunt, kill, and move on before patterns emerged. He could maintain his day job, his relationship, his veneer of normalcy, while accumulating a body count that would eventually rival the most notorious serial killers in American history. The scorecard was his mistake, or perhaps his arrogance. He couldn't resist keeping track, quantifying his success, creating a permanent record of his achievements. Each entry was a puzzle for investigators, a breadcrumb trail back through more than a decade of murder. As detectives began matching entries to unsolved cases, the scope of Kraft's crimes became horrifyingly clear. He hadn't killed 5 or 10 victims. He'd killed dozens, possibly more. The list in his car represented only the ones he bothered to record, the ones significant enough to earn a place in his private ledger. That night in May, as officers Howard and Sterling placed Randy Kraft in handcuffs, they had no idea they just captured a monster who'd been feeding for over a decade. They knew they had a murderer, the body in the passenger seat made that clear. But they couldn't yet comprehend the scale. That would come later, as investigators worked through the scorecard, as bodies were exhumed and re-examined, as the true dimensions of Randy Kraft's darkness came into focus. He smiled at the officers as they read him his rights. That same mild expression, as if he were being arrested for a parking violation rather than murder. His calm was absolute, his control unwavering. Even caught red-handed with a corpse beside him and evidence of serial murder filling his vehicle, Randy Kraft maintained the fiction of normality. Perhaps he thought he could talk his way out. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine a world where someone like him, intelligent, educated, middle class, would be held accountable. Or perhaps, after 16 years of successful killing, he'd simply stopped believing he could be caught at all. Orange County District Attorney's Office, 1983. Senior Deputy District Attorney Brian Brown sat at a desk buried under file boxes, each containing fragments of horror that had been accumulating for over a decade. Unsolved murders, missing persons, bodies found along highways with injuries so severe that cause of death became academic. Before Randy Kraft's arrest, these cases existed in isolation. Tragic but disconnected events scattered across 3 states and a dozen jurisdictions. Now, with the scorecard as a guide, Brown and his team faced the monumental task of connecting 67 cryptic entries to actual human remains. The challenge was staggering. Some entries were obvious. Marine Carson corresponded to a Marine killed near Carson, California. Others were maddeningly vague. What you got could mean anything, could reference any of the hundreds of unsolved murders in the database. Some victims had never been reported missing. Some bodies had never been found. Some entries might represent successful kills that left no trace whatsoever. Victims so thoroughly erased that even their absence went unnoticed. Investigators began the painstaking process of reconstruction, working backward from the scorecard to identify victims and crime scenes. What emerged was a portrait of methodical savagery that redefined the understanding of serial murder. The autopsies told stories that even hardened forensic pathologists found difficult to process. Kraft's victims didn't die quickly. They died slowly, deliberately, their bodies bearing evidence of torture that extended for hours. Ligature marks on wrists and ankles showed they'd been restrained. Burn marks suggested cigarettes or heated implements pressed against skin. Foreign objects, bottles, sticks, tools, had been inserted into body cavities with enough force to cause internal damage. Stab wounds clustered around genitals and buttocks, targeting areas that would inflict maximum pain while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. Many victims showed signs of sexual assault, though determining the exact nature proved challenging given the post-mortem intervals. But the pattern was consistent enough to establish Kraft's modus operandi. He feminized his victims through torture and humiliation, systematically breaking them down both physically and psychologically before finally allowing them to die. The strangulation marks on their necks were often deep and pronounced, suggesting he took his time with the killing itself, perhaps releasing and reapplying pressure, making them pass out and reviving them multiple times before the final compression. The toxicology reports added another layer of horror. Nearly every victim who could be tested showed high levels of alcohol and sedatives in their system, particularly chloral hydrate, a powerful sleep aid that, when combined with alcohol, becomes what's commonly known as a Mickey Finn. Kraft would ply his victims with drinks laced with sedatives, rendering them compliant and disoriented. They would remain conscious but unable to effectively resist, trapped in their own bodies as he did whatever he wanted. It was a deliberate choice, a way of maintaining control while keeping them aware of their helplessness. The photographs found in Kraft's vehicle provided visual confirmation of the medical findings. Detectives who viewed them described images so disturbing that many requested transfers off the case. Young men unconscious or semi-conscious, clearly drugged, positioned in degrading poses. Some photos showed victims clearly alive but incapacitated. Others showed them during torture, eyes open, faces contorted in agony. A few showed them after death, arranged like artwork for Kraft's camera. Each photograph was numbered and dated with the meticulous precision of a scientific catalog. But perhaps the most unnerving aspect of the photographic evidence was what it revealed about Kraft's relationship with his crimes. He wasn't documenting them for future thrill-seeking or to relive the experiences. The photos were clinical, almost dispassionate. They looked less like the work of a sadist getting off on his own brutality and more like documentation for a research project. Kraft was studying his victims, observing their responses, treating murder as a craft he was perfecting through repetition and experimentation. Detective J. Tarnoff, one of the lead investigators, later described the experience of working the Kraft case as descending into a world where human life had absolutely no value. The more they uncovered, the more clear it became that Kraft viewed his victims not as people but as objects, disposable props in scenarios he orchestrated for his own gratification. He felt no remorse, no guilt, no connection to the suffering he inflicted. In his mind, he was simply indulging a preference, satisfying an appetite no different than someone who enjoys fine wine or classic cars. The scorecard itself became a Rosetta Stone for murder. Forensic linguists and cryptographers worked alongside detectives to decode entries, looking for patterns in Kraft's abbreviation system. Some connections were straightforward. Marine Carson was Lance Corporal Scott Michael Hughes, found dead in Carson, California, in 1972. Portland blood corresponded to Roger James DeVole Jr., discovered in Oregon in 1975 with his skull crushed and massive internal bleeding. 2IN1 Hitch referred to a night when Kraft picked up two hitchhikers, killed them both, and dumped their bodies together near Seal Beach. Other entries remained stubbornly opaque. New Year's Eve could reference any of several murders that occurred around that holiday. England might indicate a victim from Britain or simply a location meaningful to Kraft. What you got resisted all attempts at interpretation. These unsolved entries haunted investigators, representing victims who would never be identified, families who would never get closure, murders that would remain forever unresolved despite knowing exactly who committed them. The geographic scope of Kraft's crimes complicated prosecution. Bodies had been found in California, Oregon, and Michigan. Potential crime scenes spanned 3 states and hundreds of miles of highway. Each jurisdiction had its own laws, its own procedures, its own political considerations. Building a prosecutable case required coordination on a scale rarely attempted in American criminal justice. Orange County took the lead, choosing to focus on 16 murders where evidence was strongest and Kraft's connection could be definitively proven. Prosecutors faced another challenge: proving premeditation and special circumstances necessary for a death penalty case. Kraft was too intelligent to have left traditional evidence like fingerprints or fibers. DNA analysis was still emerging science, not yet admissible in court. The case would rest primarily on circumstantial evidence: the photographs, the scorecard, the physical evidence in his vehicle, and testimony from witnesses who'd seen him with victims shortly before their deaths. The defense strategy became immediately clear: attack the scorecard's credibility. Kraft's attorneys argued the list was ambiguous, that the entries could mean anything, that prosecutors were engaged in wild speculation by connecting cryptic phrases to specific murders. They portrayed Kraft as a scapegoat, a convenient suspect onto whom law enforcement dumped every unsolved murder in Southern California. The photographs, they claimed, might show consenting adults engaged in rough sex play. The drugs could have been taken voluntarily. Even Terry Gambrell's death in the passenger seat might have been accidental, a sex act gone wrong rather than premeditated murder. It was an audacious defense, requiring the jury to believe that Kraft's arrest with a fresh corpse beside him was merely unfortunate timing, that the photographs of tortured and dying men were consensual documentation, that the scorecard was meaningless coincidence. But Kraft had advantages. He was educated, articulate, and white. He had no prior criminal record. He'd successfully maintained his cover for 16 years, which meant he was very good at appearing normal. If he could convince even a single juror that reasonable doubt existed, he could avoid conviction. The prosecution's case required reconstructing a timeline of horror spanning more than a decade. They brought in forensic experts who testified about torture methods and cause of death. They called witnesses who'd seen Kraft with victims hours before their bodies turned up. They presented the photographs, edited for the jury but still powerful, showing clearly that the men in them were not willing participants. They walked through the scorecard entry by entry, matching abbreviations to corpses, building an overwhelming circumstantial case that Randy Kraft was responsible for at least 67 murders. One particularly devastating piece of evidence came from Kraft's longtime partner, Jeff Seelig. He testified that Kraft would disappear for hours or days, returning with no explanation. That he'd found photographs similar to those in the car hidden in their shared home. That Kraft had strange habits, insisting on always driving, becoming agitated when his routines were disrupted, showing no emotional response to news reports about murdered young men found along local highways. Seelig's testimony was careful, measured, and absolutely damning. It painted Kraft not as a monster who exploded in sudden violence, but as someone who compartmentalized his life with surgical precision, maintaining his day-to-day existence while systematically hunting and killing on the side. The medical examiner's testimony was clinical but devastating. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who'd performed autopsies on many of Kraft's victims, described injuries in detached medical terminology that somehow made them more horrible. Fractured hyoid bones from manual strangulation. Perimortem trauma indicating torture before death. Evidence of ligature marks and restraints. Each technical detail added weight to the prosecution's case, building a medical record of sustained brutality that no defense argument could adequately explain away. Psychologists called by the prosecution attempted to profile Kraft, though he refused to participate in any evaluation. Based on his crimes and what little personal information was available, they described a narcissistic personality with complete lack of empathy, someone who viewed other humans as objects existing solely for his use. The organized nature of his crimes, the planning, the documentation, the careful disposal, indicated high intelligence and emotional control. He wasn't killing in fits of rage or psychotic episodes. He was killing because he enjoyed it and because he could. The trial became a media sensation, though coverage was constrained by the graphic nature of the evidence. Court TV didn't yet exist, but newspapers ran daily updates, carefully describing the testimony without reproducing the most disturbing details. Randy Kraft became a household name, though most people knew only the surface facts. The scorecard, the list of victims, the computer consultant who led a double life. The true depths of his sadism remained largely hidden from public view, protected by judges who recognized that some details were too horrific for general consumption. Throughout the proceedings, Kraft maintained his composure. He sat at the defense table in a suit and tie, taking notes, occasionally whispering to his attorneys. He showed no emotion when photographs of his victims were displayed. He didn't react when witnesses described finding their loved ones' bodies. His effect was flat, almost bored, as if the trial were an inconvenient business meeting rather than a proceeding that would determine whether he lived or died. That emotional absence became its own kind of evidence, a window into the void where his conscience should have been. The jury deliberated for 13 days, an unusually long period reflecting the complexity of the case and the weight of the decision. They had to work through 16 separate murder charges, evaluate hundreds of pieces of evidence, and determine whether the prosecution had proven beyond reasonable doubt that Randy Kraft was responsible for each victim. The photographs alone required hours of review. The scorecard demanded careful analysis. Each medical examiner's report had to be weighed against the defense's alternative explanations. When they finally returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts, guilty of 16 murders with special circumstances. The same jury would now decide whether Randy Kraft should be executed or spend the rest of his life in prison. Understanding Randy Kraft requires venturing into territory where psychology and philosophy blur into something uglier than either discipline typically confronts. He wasn't insane in any clinical sense. He didn't hear voices or suffer delusions. He understood that murder was wrong in the legal and social sense. He simply didn't care. His crimes weren't the product of damaged cognition or psychotic breaks. They were the expression of a personality structured around dominance, control, and the extraction of pleasure from suffering. Criminal psychologists who studied the case identified Kraft as a textbook example of what they call an organized serial killer. Unlike disorganized killers who murder impulsively and chaotically, organized killers plan meticulously. They select victims based on specific criteria. They control crime scenes, managing evidence and minimizing risk. They often lead seemingly normal lives, maintaining jobs and relationships while secretly hunting on the side. Ted Bundy was organized. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was organized. And Randy Kraft was perhaps the most organized of them all. His victim selection revealed a specific pathology. Kraft targeted young men who reminded him of an idealized masculine archetype: military personnel, hitchhikers, college students. They were typically white, fit, conventionally attractive by mainstream standards. Many had short hair and clean-cut appearances, the kind of men who appeared in recruitment posters or fraternity photographs. Psychologists theorized that Kraft was attracted to the masculinity these men represented, but simultaneously compelled to destroy it, to reduce them from powerful masculine figures to helpless, feminized victims. The torture itself followed patterns that suggested ritualized behavior. Kraft would systematically break down his victims' agency and dignity before killing them. The sexual assault wasn't primarily about sexual gratification in the conventional sense. It was about power, about forcing his victims into submissive positions that contradicted their masculine self-image. The torture that focused on genitals and buttocks wasn't random sadism but targeted emasculation, a deliberate attack on the physical markers of manhood. He wanted to transform them from men into objects, to strip away everything that made them powerful and leave them broken. The photographs served a similar function. By documenting the torture, Kraft created permanent records of his dominance. The men in those pictures were no longer autonomous individuals. They were exhibits in Kraft's personal museum of control. Some photographs showed victims clearly conscious and in pain, aware of what was happening but unable to stop it. Others showed them unconscious or dead, arranged in poses that emphasized their helplessness. Each image was a trophy, a frozen moment of absolute power that Kraft could revisit whenever he wanted. But the scorecard revealed something even more disturbing about Kraft's psychology. He viewed murder as an accomplishment worthy of documentation. Each entry represented a success, a target acquired and eliminated. The cryptic abbreviations suggested that he was categorizing kills, perhaps by method or location or some other classification system known only to him. It was the behavior of someone who approached murder with the same analytical mindset others might apply to birdwatching or stamp collecting, a hobby pursued with passion and attention to detail. What made Kraft particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize. His partner Jeff Seelig lived with him for years without suspecting the truth. His co-workers described him as professional and competent. His friends saw him as funny and sociable. He attended parties, maintained employment, paid his bills, engaged in all the mundane activities that constitute normal adult life. The killing wasn't his entire identity. It was something he did on the side, an extracurricular activity he pursued when the mood struck. That ability to switch between personas without apparent cognitive dissonance marks the true psychopath. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist who studied the case extensively, placed Kraft at the maximum level on his scale of evil, a ranking system that categorizes murderers based on the severity and nature of their crimes. Stone's scale runs from 1 to 22, with 22 reserved for psychopathic serial killers who torture their victims before killing them. Kraft earned that ranking not just because of the number of his victims, but because of what he did to them. The prolonged torture, the calculated dehumanization, the complete absence of empathy or remorse, these factors combined to make him one of the most dangerous personalities Stone had ever evaluated. Comparing Kraft to other serial killers reveals both similarities and unique characteristics. Like John Wayne Gacy, he maintained a respectable public facade while murdering prolifically. Like Jeffrey Dahmer, he targeted young men and incorporated sexual elements into his killings. Like Dennis Rader, he documented his crimes obsessively. But Kraft's body count potentially exceeded them all. While investigators could definitively link him to only 16 murders, the scorecard suggested 67, and some experts believe the true number might be higher. Kraft hunted for 16 years across multiple states. The number of unidentified victims, people who disappeared without anyone reporting them missing, could push his total well beyond what's documented. The question that haunted investigators and psychologists alike was, how did he go undetected for so long? The answer lies in the intersection of victim selection, jurisdictional fragmentation, and social prejudice. Kraft targeted vulnerable men, hitchhikers, drifters, servicemen away from home. These were populations that moved frequently, whose absences might not be immediately noticed. He also operated during an era when law enforcement agencies rarely coordinated across state lines, when databases were primitive or non-existent, when serial murder itself was poorly understood as a phenomenon. Additionally, Kraft benefited from a form of institutional bias. Many of his victims were gay or perceived as gay. During the 1970s and early 1980s, crimes against LGBTQ individuals often received less investigative attention. Some departments treated these cases as lower priority, assuming the victims had simply moved on or were involved in high-risk lifestyles. This social prejudice created cover for Kraft, allowing him to kill with reduced scrutiny. He understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. The geographic component of his hunting pattern also provided protection. Kraft moved constantly, driving between California, Oregon, and Michigan, dumping bodies across multiple jurisdictions. A body found in Oregon wouldn't be connected to one found in California. Patterns that might have been obvious if plotted on a single map remained invisible when spread across separate police departments with no communication protocols. Kraft essentially created his own invisibility by staying mobile, by never hunting too intensively in any single area. But beyond the practical factors lay something more fundamental. Randy Kraft looked normal. He was white, educated, middle-class, articulate. He wore glasses and worked in computers. He didn't match anyone's stereotype of a serial killer because those stereotypes, to the extent they existed in the early 1980s, centered on dysfunctional loners living in squalor. Kraft had a career, a long-term partner, a social life. The cognitive dissonance between his appearance and his actions created a form of psychological camouflage. People simply couldn't reconcile the friendly computer consultant with the monster who tortured young men to death for entertainment. His intelligence played a crucial role in his success. Kraft was genuinely smart, capable of complex planning and risk assessment. He learned from close calls, adjusting his methods when situations got dangerous. He managed evidence carefully, rarely leaving forensic material at crime scenes. He understood police procedure well enough to avoid obvious mistakes. And he possessed the emotional control necessary to interact normally with others while carrying the memories of his crimes. That combination of intelligence, planning, and emotional regulation made him extraordinarily difficult to catch. The psychological profile that emerged during his trial painted a picture of profound narcissism. Kraft believed he was superior to other people, that rules didn't apply to him, that he was entitled to take what he wanted. His victims existed in his mind as resources to be consumed, no different than food or fuel. Their suffering meant nothing because he experienced no empathy, no emotional connection to other humans beyond their utility to him. This absolute self-centeredness is the hallmark of psychopathy, the inability to recognize others as possessing equivalent consciousness and worth. Yet despite this coldness, Kraft wasn't completely isolated from human society. His relationship with Jeff Seelig appeared genuine in its way, though clearly compartmentalized. He had friends who liked him. He could be charming and funny when it served his purposes. This ability to form superficial connections while remaining fundamentally disconnected is another psychopathic trait. He understood social interaction intellectually, could perform the expected behaviors, but didn't experience the underlying emotions. He was acting as a human rather than being one. The question of motivation, why Kraft killed, has no satisfying answer because his motivations weren't rational in any conventional sense. He killed because he enjoyed it. The torture produced pleasure. The dominance satisfied something in him that couldn't be satisfied any other way. Psychological theories about childhood trauma or biological predisposition provide partial explanations at best. Some people are simply wired wrong, their reward systems activated by behaviors that would disgust most humans. Kraft was one of them. Understanding this doesn't excuse his actions or minimize his responsibility. Kraft made choices. He could have sought help, could have found other outlets, could have simply not murdered. He understood that what he was doing was wrong in the legal sense. His careful evidence management proved he knew he was committing crimes. He simply didn't care about the moral dimension. His desires outweighed any consideration for his victim's humanity. That's not insanity. That's evil. The word evil gets overused, applied to everything from petty cruelty to genuine atrocity. But if evil means anything, it describes people like Randy Kraft, individuals who fully understand the harm they're causing but proceed anyway because their own gratification matters more than others' suffering. Kraft looked into the eyes of conscious, terrified victims and felt nothing but satisfaction. He heard them beg and found it entertaining. He watched them die and checked their names off a list. That's evil in its purest form, undiluted by insanity or diminished capacity. The trial forced everyone involved to confront this evil directly. Jurors had to view photographs and hear testimony that exposed them to the worst of human capability. Families of victims had to sit through clinical descriptions of how their sons and brothers died. Even the defense attorneys, professionals trained to advocate for their clients, struggled with the reality of what Kraft had done. One attorney later admitted in an interview that representing Kraft was the most difficult assignment of his career, not because of public perception, but because of the knowledge he carried about his client's actions. This confrontation with evil serves a purpose beyond the immediate legal proceedings. It reminds us that monsters are real, that they walk among us wearing human faces, that the boundary between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we'd like to believe. Randy Kraft worked a normal job, paid taxes, maintained relationships, and spent his free time torturing people to death. Those facts exist simultaneously without contradiction because humans are capable of extraordinary compartmentalization. We want to believe that killers are obvious, that evil announces itself, that we'd recognize danger if it approached us. Kraft's case proves otherwise. The penalty phase of Randy Kraft's trial began in November 1989, more than 6 years after his arrest. The jury had already convicted him of 16 murders with special circumstances. Now they faced the question that haunts every death penalty case. Should the state kill him? Prosecutors argued for death with the same methodical approach they'd used during the guilt phase. They presented evidence of aggravating factors: the number of victims, the torture inflicted, the complete absence of remorse. They reminded jurors of the photographs, the scorecard, the cold calculation behind every kill. They pointed out that Kraft had shown no mercy to his victims, had granted them no consideration when they begged for their lives. Justice, the prosecution argued, demanded equivalent response. The defense faced an impossible task. How do you humanize someone who spent 16 years dehumanizing others? They tried. They presented evidence of Kraft's childhood, looking for mitigating factors, abuse, trauma, anything that might explain his actions without excusing them. They found nothing significant. Kraft's upbringing was unremarkable. His parents were decent people. He'd suffered no obvious abuse or neglect. The defense called psychologists who testified about personality disorders and diminished capacity, but the experts couldn't point to any specific condition that would qualify as legal mitigation. In the end, the defense's best argument was simply that killing Kraft wouldn't bring back his victims, that life imprisonment without parole would achieve the same goal of protecting society without requiring the state to commit its own act of killing. It was a philosophical argument rather than a legal one, appealing to jurors' consciences rather than their reason. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with their verdict: death. The decision was unanimous. Randy Stephen Kraft would be executed for his crimes. Superior Court Judge Donald McCartan, who presided over the trial, formally sentenced Kraft to death on November 29, 1989. In his statement, McCartan called Kraft the most extensive killer this court has ever experienced, and noted that the crimes exceeded in callousness any murder I've handled in 26 years. He expressed hope that the families of victims might find some measure of closure, though he acknowledged that nothing could truly compensate for their losses. Kraft showed no reaction to the sentence. He sat quietly at the defense table, displaying the same flat effect he'd maintained throughout the trial. When given an opportunity to speak, he declined. His silence in the face of death sentence was consistent with his behavior throughout, an absolute refusal to acknowledge responsibility or express remorse. The appeals process began immediately, as it does in all death penalty cases. Kraft's attorneys filed motion after motion, challenging everything from jury selection to evidence admissibility to the fundamental constitutionality of capital punishment. The California appellate system, already overwhelmed with death penalty cases, moved with glacial slowness. Years became decades. The urgency of the trial faded into bureaucratic routine. Meanwhile, Kraft settled into life on San Quentin's death row. Cell number E78999 became his home, a 6 by 9 foot space containing a bunk, toilet, and sink. Death row inmates live in isolation, allowed out of their cells only for exercise and occasional visitors. It's a kind of living death, existence without purpose or variation, days bleeding into weeks into years without meaningful distinction. For someone like Kraft, who'd spent years hunting and killing at will, the confinement represented absolute loss of control. But Kraft adapted. He maintained correspondence with several people, including some who'd become fascinated with his case. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and true crime writers, though he never confessed to crimes beyond those for which he'd been convicted. In these interviews, he remained eerily composed, discussing his case in detached terms as if it concerned someone else entirely. He criticized the investigation, questioned the evidence, maintained his innocence in the face of overwhelming proof. His denial was absolute and unwavering. The victims' families received no such peace. For them, Kraft's conviction and death sentence marked the beginning of a different kind of torture, waiting. Waiting for appeals to be exhausted. Waiting for an execution date that never came. Waiting for closure that the legal system promised but couldn't deliver. Some families gave up hope of ever seeing justice completed. Parents died without witnessing their son's killer executed. Siblings grew old carrying grief that never fully healed. Investigators continued working on the unsolved entries in Kraft's scorecard. They reviewed cold cases, re-interviewed witnesses, applied new forensic techniques to old evidence. Some entries they eventually solved, matching cryptic phrases to specific victims through painstaking detective work. Many remained mysteries. What you got never yielded its secret. England defied all interpretation. Dozens of possible victims were identified and investigated, but without concrete proof linking them to Kraft, they remained in limbo. Probable murders that could never be officially attributed. The true scope of Kraft's killing may never be known. 67 entries in the scorecard represent the minimum, the victims he considered significant enough to document. But serial killers often kill more than they record. Some murders don't go according to plan and get excluded from the tally. Some victims might have been killed before Kraft started keeping the list. And some investigators believe Kraft may have had additional scorecards, documenting kills that occurred before 1971 or after 1983 that were never found. One detective who worked the case extensively estimated the true body count might exceed 100. That number would make Randy Kraft one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, competing with Gary Ridgway and Samuel Little for the grim distinction of most victims. But without proof, those additional murders remain speculation, ghosts in the margins of an already horrific story. The broader implications of Kraft's case extended beyond his individual crimes. Law enforcement agencies recognized the need for better coordination across jurisdictions. The scorecard demonstrated how a mobile killer could exploit gaps in communication between police departments. In response, California and other states developed better database systems for tracking unsolved murders, looking for patterns that might indicate serial killing. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, expanded, attempting to create national infrastructure for identifying serial offenders before they accumulated massive body counts. Kraft's case also contributed to evolving understanding of serial murder psychology. He didn't fit the emerging profile of disorganized, mentally ill killers. He was methodical, intelligent, and socially functional. This realization forced criminal psychologists to recognize that serial killers exist across a spectrum of functionality, that some are far more dangerous precisely because they blend seamlessly into normal society. The organized/disorganized dichotomy became standard teaching in criminal psychology programs, with Kraft serving as a primary case study in organized killing. The LGBTQ community grappled with complex reactions to the case. Kraft was openly gay, and his crimes targeted young men, some of whom were also gay or questioning. Some activists worried that the case would fuel homophobic narratives equating homosexuality with predatory behavior. Others argued that the gay community needed to confront the reality that monsters exist within every population, that addressing the problem required acknowledging it rather than minimizing it. The conversation was painful but necessary, forcing recognition that sexual orientation doesn't immunize anyone from being either a perpetrator or victim of violence. In the broader culture, Randy Kraft became a fixture in true crime media. Books were written about his case. Documentaries featured interviews with investigators and surviving witnesses. Crime enthusiasts dissected the scorecard, debating interpretations of unclear entries. Some developed an unhealthy fascination with Kraft himself, sending him letters and money, treating him like a dark celebrity rather than a mass murderer. This phenomenon, serial killer fandom, disturbs criminologists and victims' families alike, but persists despite all criticism. Kraft himself seemed to enjoy the attention. In interviews from death row, he discussed his case with an almost academic detachment, pointing out what he considered flaws in the prosecution's logic, suggesting alternative interpretations of evidence. He never confessed, never showed remorse, never acknowledged his victims as human beings who'd suffered because of him. His narcissism remained intact even in confinement, his sense of superiority undiminished by conviction and condemnation. Years passed, then decades. The appeals process continued its slow march through the California court system. Kraft's case was automatically appealed to the California Supreme Court, which reviewed the conviction and death sentence for procedural errors. In 2000, after more than a decade of review, the Supreme Court upheld both the conviction and sentence. Kraft's attorneys immediately filed federal habeas corpus petitions, beginning another round of appeals in federal court. The delay frustrated everyone involved. Victims' families wanted closure. Prosecutors wanted the sentence carried out. Even some death penalty opponents questioned whether a system that took 30-plus years to execute someone served any useful purpose. But the wheels of justice, once set in motion, move at their own pace, constrained by constitutional requirements and institutional capacity. While waiting on death row, Kraft watched as California's death penalty system effectively ground to a halt. Executions became increasingly rare, then stopped entirely as legal challenges and political opposition created de facto moratoria. Governors hesitated to authorize executions amid shifting public opinion. Courts imposed additional procedural requirements. Pharmaceutical companies refused to provide lethal injection drugs. The machinery of death, which had seemed inevitable in 1989, rusted from disuse. In 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom imposed a formal moratorium on all executions, calling the death penalty system racist, unjust, and unfair. He granted reprieves to all 737 inmates on California's death row, including Randy Kraft. The reprieve didn't commute Kraft's sentence or offer any possibility of release. It simply suspended his execution indefinitely. Kraft would die in prison, but likely from old age rather than state execution. This outcome enraged victims' families who'd waited decades for justice. They'd been promised that Kraft would die for his crimes, that the state would exact the same finality he'd imposed on their loved ones. Instead, they watched him age into his 70s, still alive, still breathing, still occupying space in a world their sons and brothers had been forced to leave decades earlier. The betrayal they felt was profound and justified. But from another perspective, Kraft's fate represents a different kind of justice. He exists in a 6x9 cell, stripped of freedom, autonomy, and control, the very things he valued most. His hunting days are over permanently. He'll never experience the rush of power that came from dominating and destroying another person. He's trapped in a cage, reduced to a number, forgotten by everyone except those who remember what he did. For someone whose entire identity centered on control and superiority, that might be worse than execution. San Quentin State Prison today houses California's death row, a condemned facility itself scheduled for eventual closure. Randy Kraft remains there, inmate E78999, now in his late 70s. He's outlived many of his victims, whose lives were cut short in their 20s. He's outlived some of the detectives who investigated his crimes and prosecutors who convicted him. He's outlived parents who died waiting to see him executed. His longevity is itself a form of injustice, a reminder that sometimes the wicked prosper while the innocent suffer. But he hasn't escaped. His name remains synonymous with evil in the annals of American crime. His case is studied in criminal justice programs as an example of methodical serial killing. His scorecard has been analyzed in countless books and articles. His photographs, the ones he took of dying victims, exist in evidence lockers, permanent documentation of his monstrosity. He wanted to be remembered as superior, as someone who'd transcended ordinary morality. Instead, he's remembered as a monster, a cautionary tale, a warning about what humans are capable of when empathy fails. The 67 entries in his scorecard represent 67 lives stolen, 67 families destroyed, 67 futures erased. Some of those victims have names and faces recovered through investigation. Many remain John Does, unknown soldiers in Kraft's private war against humanity. They were sons, brothers, friends, lovers. They had dreams and plans and people who cared about them. Randy Kraft reduced them to abbreviations in a notebook, meaningless symbols in his personal code. That's his legacy, not the intelligence he possessed or the control he maintained or the years he evaded capture. His legacy is suffering, the suffering he inflicted on his victims and the ongoing suffering of families who'll never fully recover from their losses. His legacy is absence, the empty chairs at family dinners, the grandchildren never born, the lives never lived because he decided they served his purposes better as corpses than as human beings. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, Randy Stephen Kraft sits in his cell on death row. He's reading, perhaps, or writing letters, or simply staring at concrete walls he's memorized over 35 years of confinement. He's old now, his body failing in the way all bodies eventually do. The violence that once defined him exists only in memory and record. The scorecard sits in an evidence locker, its cryptic entries still guarding secrets about victims who'll never be identified. And somewhere in the darkness, on highways and in cities across America, other scorecards are being compiled. Other killers are hunting, documenting, adding names to lists that won't be discovered until chance or mistake brings them into the light. The monsters are always out there, walking among us, wearing human faces, waiting for vulnerability to reveal itself. Randy Kraft taught us that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs. It comes dressed in normalcy, speaking politely, offering help when we need it most. It drives a Toyota Celica and works with computers and maintains relationships and seems completely, utterly ordinary until the moment it isn't. The highway continues into the distance, an endless ribbon of asphalt carrying travelers toward destinations they may never reach. The darkness swallows everything eventually, and in that darkness, the scorecards keep growing, entry by entry, victim by victim, until someone finally notices the pattern and forces the monster into the light. Some killers leave bodies. Randy Stephen Kraft kept score, and 67 times he won. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Murder Castle, H.H. Holmes and America's First Serial Killer. Tonight, we descend into the belly of a building that ate people alive. A palace of profit built on a foundation of screams, where guests checked in with luggage and left as nothing but ash and bone. This is the story of Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who smiled like a gentleman while turning Chicago's World's Fair into his personal hunting ground. They called him H.H. Holmes. His victims called him nothing because dead women tell no tales. Welcome to the Murder Castle. The year is 1893, and Chicago is burning with ambition. Not literally, not yet, but with the kind of feverish energy that transforms swampland into skylines, that pulls millions of dreamers toward a single, glittering promise: the world's Columbian Exposition, the greatest fair the world has ever seen. White City, they're calling it, a temporary utopia of electric lights and Ferris wheels, of exotic villages and technological wonders that will showcase America's arrival as a modern power. The future is here, gleaming and bright, but every light casts a shadow. Just blocks away from the fairgrounds, on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets, stands a building that defies explanation. 3 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture, complete with turrets and bay windows, retail space on the ground floor, apartments above. To the casual observer, it's simply another commercial building in Englewood, a rapidly developing neighborhood capitalizing on the fair's anticipated flood of visitors. The locals call it the Castle, though not because of any particular grandeur. There's just something about its sprawling, irregular structure, something that makes people uncomfortable without quite knowing why. They should trust their instincts. The man who built this monstrosity stands at his pharmacy counter on the ground floor, measuring out patent medicines with the precision of someone who understands chemistry far too well. Herman Webster Mudgett, though he hasn't used that name in years. Now he's Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a name borrowed from a fictional detective, which is fitting because his entire existence is a performance, a carefully constructed lie delivered with a smile that could sell salvation to the damned. And what a smile it is. Women find him magnetic. Men find him trustworthy. He's handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way. Bright blue eyes, dark mustache neatly trimmed, clothes always impeccably tailored. He speaks with the confidence of education, throwing around medical terminology and business jargon with equal ease. He's charming, helpful, the kind of man you'd trust with your daughter's virtue or your life savings. You'd be wrong on both counts. Holmes didn't start out as a monster, or perhaps he did, and simply learned to hide it better as he aged. Born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire in 1861, young Herman showed early signs of what we'd now recognize as sociopathy. He tortured animals with the methodical curiosity of a scientist, watching their suffering with those same blue eyes, empty of empathy. His childhood was marked by poverty and a father's alcoholic rage, a home where violence was currency and cruelty was commonplace. But Herman was smart, dangerously smart. He clawed his way to the University of Michigan's medical school, where he discovered 2 things that would define his future. First, that he had no qualms about working with human corpses, and second, that corpses could be profitable. Insurance fraud became his specialty. Steal a cadaver, disfigure it, claim it as a deceased relative, collect the payout. It was elegant in its simplicity, and it taught him a valuable lesson. Dead bodies are worth more than living ones if you know how to work the system. After medical school, he drifted through a series of schemes and scams, marriages and mistresses, always one step ahead of creditors and consequences. He abandoned his first wife, Mudgett's wife technically, since that's who he was then, and their child without ceremony or conscience. He married again under a false name, then again without bothering to divorce. Women were tools to be used and discarded. Money was the only god worth worshipping. Then came Chicago and the opportunity of a lifetime. He arrived in the city in 1886, taking a job at a pharmacy owned by an elderly doctor named Holton. The doctor's wife had recently died, and the old man was struggling to manage the business alone. Holmes was everything Holton needed: energetic, knowledgeable, charismatic with customers. When Holton's health began failing, Holmes offered to buy the pharmacy. The terms were generous, payment spread over time. Holton agreed, grateful to have found such an honorable young man to carry on his legacy. Holton was never seen again. When neighbors asked about the old doctor, Holmes explained that he'd moved to California for his health. So sad, so sudden. But these things happen, don't they? And the pharmacy needed running, customers needed serving, life needed to go on. No one questioned the story because no one had reason to doubt the charming Dr. Holmes. This was his pattern, his methodology, refined to perfection through practice. He would identify what he wanted: property, money, women, all 3, and then he would simply take it, covering his tracks with a story delivered in that reassuring voice, accompanied by that trustworthy smile. And if someone stood between Holmes and what he wanted, well, Chicago was a big city. People disappeared all the time. With the pharmacy secured and profitable, Holmes began to dream bigger. The World's Fair was coming, bringing millions of visitors who would need places to stay. Englewood was perfectly positioned to capitalize on the overflow from downtown hotels. What if he built his own hotel? A large building with commercial space, apartments to rent, maybe even a restaurant? What if he built something special? Construction began in 1887, and from the beginning, it was clear that this would be no ordinary building. Holmes hired and fired construction crews with dizzying frequency, never allowing any single team to see the complete plans. He claimed this was about cost control, about keeping labor competitive. The real reason was far more sinister. Holmes didn't want anyone to understand the building's true purpose, because the castle wasn't designed for guests. It was designed for murder. The building plans he drew up himself, Holmes had studied architecture along with his other pursuits, contained features that made sense only if you understood their intended use. Doors that opened onto brick walls, stairways that led nowhere, hallways that twisted back on themselves in impossible configurations, second-floor apartments with no visible means of entry or exit, gas lines running into sealed rooms with control valves accessible only from the outside, walls lined with asbestos, soundproofing throughout. And then there were the special rooms. One chamber was designed as an oversized walk-in vault, airtight when sealed, with a gas line connection. Another room featured walls lined with iron plates and a blowtorch connection. The basement was where things got truly creative. There, Holmes installed a dissection table with specialized drainage, a massive furnace capable of reaching temperatures hot enough to creep bones, pits of quicklime for dissolving flesh, an array of surgical instruments hung with the care of a craftsman's tools. This was no hotel. This was an abattoir, a processing plant for human bodies, a machine designed to transform living, breathing people into ash and bone and profit, operating with industrial efficiency. The construction workers who briefly glimpsed pieces of this nightmare assumed they were misunderstanding the plans. Surely no one would build such things. Surely there was a rational explanation. They took their pay and moved on, never seeing the complete picture, never understanding that they were helping to build America's first custom-designed murder factory. By 1892, as the city's excitement about the upcoming World's Fair reached a fever pitch, the castle stood complete. Holmes moved his pharmacy to the ground floor, maintaining his respectable businessman facade. He rented out retail space to other shops, keeping up appearances. On the upper floors, he advertised rooms for rent, targeting the single young women flooding into Chicago for jobs related to the fair. These women were perfect victims. Alone in a strange city, no family nearby to notice their absence, desperate for affordable housing and charmed by the handsome, respectable doctor who offered such reasonable rates. They came to the castle looking for shelter and opportunity. They found only darkness. One of the first was Julia Smythe, the wife of a man who worked in one of the castle's ground floor businesses. Holmes seduced her with practiced ease, promising love and a future together. When she became pregnant with his child, he performed an abortion that he assured her would be safe. She died on his table, and her body disappeared into the castle's depths. Her husband, Ned, asked questions. Holmes expressed sympathetic concern, suggesting Julia had run off with another man. Ned, heartbroken and confused, eventually left Chicago. He never learned that his wife's remains had fed the castle's furnace. The pattern repeated with variations. Emmeline Segrand, a beautiful young woman who worked as a stenographer in Holmes's office, became engaged to him, unaware that he was already married multiple times over. She confided in friends about her upcoming wedding, sharing her happiness. Then she vanished. Holmes told concerned parties that she'd returned to her family in Indiana. He sold her clothes and kept her jewelry. Minnie Williams, a wealthy woman from Texas, arrived with her sister Anna, both of them carrying a substantial inheritance. Holmes courted Minnie while secretly carrying on an affair with Anna. He convinced Minnie to deed her properties to him, then murdered Anna when she became inconvenient. Minnie disappeared shortly after, once her usefulness had expired. The castle consumed them all. Young women arrived with hopes and dreams, with futures stretching before them like open roads. They left as smoke drifting from the chimney, as bones ground to powder, as quicklime sludge washed into the sewers beneath Chicago's streets. Holmes kept souvenirs, jewelry primarily which he sold or gave to subsequent girlfriends, photographs which he studied with clinical detachment. He also kept detailed records of his experiments because that's how he thought of them, as experiments. How long could someone survive in a sealed room? What happened when you introduced gas slowly versus all at once? How did different body types respond to the same methodologies? He was a scientist of suffering, documenting death with the same rigor others brought to studying plant specimens or chemical reactions. The most terrifying thing about Holmes wasn't his cruelty, though that was immense. It wasn't his intelligence, though he was frighteningly clever. The most terrifying thing was his normality. During the day, he sold medications and made small talk with customers. He joined civic organizations. He attended church. He laughed at jokes and paid compliments and played the role of upstanding citizen with absolute conviction. At night, he locked his victims in soundproofed rooms and listened to them die. The World's Fair opened in May 1893, and Chicago transformed into a wonderland. The White City glowed with electric lights, a technology still magical to most Americans. The Ferris wheel turned against the sky, offering views of impossible heights. Foreign villages transported visitors to distant lands without leaving Illinois. 27 million people attended over 6 months, making it one of the largest events in human history at that time. Holmes walked among them, hunting. The castle's rooms were fully occupied, cycling through tenants with suspicious efficiency. Young women primarily, but also the occasional man if he looked wealthy enough. Holmes was an equal opportunity killer when profit was involved. He developed techniques, refined his methods. He learned that people would ignore almost anything if you gave them a plausible explanation delivered with confidence. He discovered that bodies were surprisingly easy to dispose of if you had the right equipment and weren't squeamish about the process. He found that murder, like anything else, improved with practice. By the time the fair closed in October 1893, Holmes had killed at least 9 people, though the true number was likely much higher. Some estimates put the death toll at over 200, though this seems exaggerated. The confirmed victims numbered in the dozens at minimum. The castle had earned its reputation, though not publicly. Not yet, because Holmes's greatest talent wasn't killing. It was making people disappear so completely that no one even realized they'd been murdered. But every machine eventually breaks down. Every performer eventually slips up. And the monster of 63rd Street was about to make his first real mistake. One that would set in motion the chain of events leading to his capture, trial, and eventual execution. The fair was over, but Holmes's appetite for death was just beginning to peak. Success breeds arrogance, and by the end of 1893, Holmes had convinced himself he was untouchable. He'd murdered dozens, maybe more, and no one suspected a thing. The castle had performed exactly as designed, efficiently processing human beings into profitable components and disposable waste. Bodies had burned, dissolved, or been sold to medical schools as anatomical specimens. Holmes had committed the perfect crimes, plural, repeatedly, but perfection is exhausting to maintain, and Holmes was getting careless. The first crack appeared not through murder but through money. Holmes was a compulsive spender, always living beyond his means, funding schemes within schemes like Russian nesting dolls of fraud. The castle itself was mortgaged to the hilt, with Holmes having taken out multiple loans from different banks, each lender unaware of the others. He owed contractors who'd worked on the building, suppliers who'd provided materials, landlords from previous residences, business partners from failed ventures. The creditors were circling, and even Holmes's silver tongue couldn't keep them at bay forever. He tried to burn the castle for insurance money, a classic Holmes move, converting a liability into profit. But the fire department responded too quickly, extinguishing the blaze before significant damage occurred. The insurance company, already suspicious of the multiple policies Holmes had taken out on the building, refused to pay. Worse, they began investigating. The authorities started asking questions. Not about murder, not yet, but about fraud. About business dealings, about debts and deeds and the confusing tangle of lies that held Holmes's financial empire together. He was facing lawsuits from multiple parties. Creditors had filed liens. His carefully constructed house of cards was wobbling. So Holmes did what he always did when things got complicated. He ran. But this time, he didn't run alone. He convinced a man named Benjamin Pittizel to join him in an insurance scheme that would make them both rich. Pittizel was a carpenter who'd worked on the castle, a man with a drinking problem and a family to support. He was desperate, and desperation made him malleable. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Pittizel would fake his own death, Holmes would collect the life insurance money, and they'd split the proceeds. Pittizel would start a new life somewhere else with his share. No one would be hurt, everyone would profit. It was the kind of scheme Holmes had pulled off multiple times before, using corpses stolen from medical schools. Except this time, Holmes decided to make one cost-saving modification. Instead of using a substitute corpse, he would actually kill Pittizel and keep all the money. It was pure Holmes, seeing an opportunity to murder for profit and taking it without hesitation. Pittizel trusted him, which made the betrayal even easier. The two men traveled to Philadelphia, where they set up the scam. Pittizel rented a house under an assumed name and established himself as a patent dealer. The stage was set. On September 3, 1894, Benjamin Pittizel died in that house, his body discovered days later, badly burned and reeking of chloroform. The official story was an accidental death, a man handling volatile chemicals for his patent work, a tragic mishap. The body was identified through personal effects and physical characteristics. The insurance company, suspicious but unable to prove fraud, eventually paid out the $10,000 policy. Holmes collected the money using forged paperwork and a complex series of intermediaries. Then he did something monumentally stupid. He went to find Pittizel's wife, Carrie, and offered to help her. This was the mistake that would destroy him, because Carrie Pittizel trusted Holmes, believed his story about her husband being alive somewhere in hiding, and agreed to let him help arrange secret meetings with Benjamin. She even allowed Holmes to take 3 of her 5 children with him on the journey: Alice, Nellie, and Howard, aged 15, 12, and 8 respectively. Holmes told Carrie he was taking the children to see their father. He promised they'd all be reunited soon. She believed him because she had no reason not to, because he'd known Benjamin, because his story made sense, because she was desperate for hope. The children were thrilled. An adventure with kind Dr. Holmes, traveling across the country, going to see Papa. Alice, the eldest, wrote cheerful letters home to her mother, describing the sights they were seeing, the places they were visiting. The letters were full of a teenager's observations about new cities and different foods and the excitement of travel. Holmes mailed these letters for her, making sure Carrie received proof that her children were safe and happy. What Carrie didn't know was that Holmes was also traveling with the remaining 2 Pittizel children and their mother, keeping the 2 groups carefully separated, telling elaborate lies to both parties about why they couldn't all be together. It was a logistical nightmare, requiring constant deception, multiple hotel rooms, careful timing. Holmes was running 2 parallel cons, keeping 2 families separated while pretending to unite them, all while staying ahead of the insurance investigators who were now definitely suspicious. Why did he do it? Why this elaborate charade? Perhaps it was the challenge, the thrill of maintaining such a complex lie. Perhaps he enjoyed the power, the control over these people's lives. Perhaps he simply saw another opportunity for profit. He was still spending the insurance money, still funding schemes, still convinced he could talk his way out of anything. But the investigators weren't giving up. An insurance detective named Frank Geyer was building a case, following paper trails, interviewing witnesses. He was learning about Holmes's history, the abandoned wives, the failed businesses, the suspicious circumstances surrounding various disappearances. The picture emerging was of a con man and possible murderer, someone far more dangerous than a simple insurance fraudster. Meanwhile, Holmes was killing again, because that's what he did, what he couldn't stop doing even when logic demanded he lay low. The Pittizel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, had become liabilities. They knew too much, had seen too much, could connect Holmes to their father's death if anyone asked the right questions. So he made them disappear. Howard went first. In Indianapolis, Holmes rented a house, sent Alice and Nellie to a hotel with a trusted accomplice, and took the 8-year-old boy with him. He later claimed he'd left Howard with someone in Indianapolis, that the boy was safe. But neighbors would later remember seeing a small trunk being loaded into a buggy, hearing something that might have been crying from inside it. Howard Pitzel was never seen alive again. Alice and Nellie remained with Holmes, still writing letters home, still believing they were on their way to see their father. They traveled to Toronto, checking into a hotel where Holmes rented a house on the outskirts of the city. He told the girls they'd be staying there for a while, that their father would join them soon. On October 25, 1894, Holmes took the two girls to the house. What happened next was discovered only months later, but the evidence told a horror story. He'd prepared a trunk, large enough for two small bodies if properly arranged. He'd set up a gas line, connected it to the trunk's interior. Alice was 15, smart enough to know something was wrong, desperate enough to fight. Nellie was 12, terrified, looking to her older sister for protection. Holmes locked them in the trunk together and turned on the gas. How long did it take? Minutes? Hours? Did they cry for help? Did Alice try to comfort her sister as the darkness closed in? Did they understand what was happening? Or did they slip away thinking this was somehow still going to be okay? That Papa would come and Dr. Holmes would explain everything and it would all make sense? They died holding each other, two sisters crammed into darkness, poisoned by the man they'd trusted, the man their parents had trusted. Holmes buried them in the basement of the rented house, covering the shallow grave with a layer of earth and debris. Then he left Toronto, returned to the United States, and continued spending the insurance money as if nothing had happened. But the net was tightening. The insurance investigators had connected enough dots to convince police that Holmes was more than a fraudster. He was likely a murderer. Multiple disappearances around him, too many bodies, too many convenient deaths. The authorities in Chicago were starting to look at the castle differently, wondering about its strange architecture, questioning the high turnover of female tenants. In November 1894, Holmes was arrested in Boston on horse theft charges. A minor crime, almost laughable compared to his actual offenses. But it was enough to hold him while investigators built their case. They started searching properties associated with Holmes, interviewing witnesses, tracking his movements over the previous years. What they found was nightmare fuel. Detective Frank Geyer was assigned to find the Pitzel children. He had Alice's letters, cheerful dispatches from a girl who didn't know she was writing her own epitaph. He began tracing Holmes's journey, following the trail of hotel registrations and rental properties, interviewing clerks and landlords and anyone who might have seen the doctor and the children. The investigation led to Indianapolis, where neighbors remembered seeing Holmes with a small boy, remembered the trunk, remembered thinking it was strange. Geyer searched properties Holmes had rented. He found tools that could have been used for digging. He found lime, the kind used to speed decomposition. He found disturbed earth in a basement, and when he dug down, he found small bones. Howard Pitzel had been buried in a shallow grave, his tiny body partially mummified by the lime. He'd been strangled or chloroformed. The decomposition made it impossible to determine exactly, then hidden like garbage, disposed of with less ceremony than most people gave to dead pets. Geyer continued to Toronto. He found the house on St. Vincent Street where Holmes had taken the girls. The current tenants knew nothing, but they granted permission to search. Geyer dug in the basement, his shovel striking something soft. He kept digging. Alice and Nellie Pitzel lay together as they died, their bodies partially decomposed but recognizable. 15 and 12 years old, murdered by a man who'd smiled at them, who'd bought them candy and told them stories, who'd promised to reunite them with their father. The discovery hit newspapers like a bomb. 3 children murdered, their father murdered, the wife widowed and childless through trusting the wrong man. And the monster responsible was H. Holmes, the same charming doctor who owned that strange building in Chicago, the man everyone had found so pleasant and trustworthy. The public went insane. This wasn't just murder. This was betrayal of the deepest kind, violence against children, the destruction of a family through calculated cruelty. People wanted blood. They wanted Holmes dead, suffering, punished beyond measure. But first, they wanted to know how many others, how many people had disappeared into his orbit. What other horrors lurked in the castle's shadows? The Chicago police raided the building on 63rd Street. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Rooms designed specifically for murder. A gas chamber disguised as a bedroom. Soundproofed cells with scratches on the walls where victims had clawed for escape. Trapdoors and secret passages. A basement that looked like a torture chamber from medieval times, complete with dissection table, surgical instruments, and acid baths. They found human remains. Not whole bodies, Holmes was too careful for that, but pieces. Bone fragments in the furnace. Teeth scattered in the ash. A woman's shoe with part of a foot still inside, preserved in lime. Buttons and jewelry and hair, tangible evidence of lives that had ended in this building. The investigators found Holmes's records, partial and cryptic but damning. Lists of names, some crossed out. Receipts for quicklime and acid. Architectural drawings showing the building's secret chambers and hidden passages. They found enough to confirm that the castle was exactly what it appeared to be. A factory for murder, designed and operated by a man who turned killing into an industrial process. The media called him the torture doctor, the archfiend, the monster of 63rd Street. They published horrifying drawings imagining what had happened in those rooms. They interviewed anyone who'd ever known Holmes, painting a picture of a charismatic sociopath who'd fooled everyone who'd ever met him. Holmes sat in jail and gave interviews, playing his final role. The misunderstood man, the victim of circumstance and media hysteria. He admitted to fraud, even claimed responsibility for some deaths while denying others. He changed his story constantly, enjoying the attention, spinning lies even when the truth would have served him better. He was, to the very end, performing. The question remained, how many victims? The police estimated at least 9 confirmed murders, possibly as many as 27. Newspaper speculation pushed the number into the hundreds, though this was almost certainly exaggerated. The truth died with Holmes, who would never provide an honest accounting. But the number didn't matter, not really. Whether 9 or 90, each victim represented a life stolen. A person who'd trusted the wrong smile, who'd walked into the castle looking for shelter or work or love and found only a monster wearing a human face. The Pitzel murders, ironically the simplest and least elaborate of Holmes's crimes, would be the ones that finally brought him to justice. Not the castle's many victims, whose disappearances had been too clean, too complete to prosecute. Not the insurance frauds or business cons, but 3 children and their father, killed for $10,000 in arrogance. Holmes was going to trial, and America couldn't wait to watch him burn. The trial of Herman Webster Mudgett, known to the world as H.H. Holmes, began on October 28, 1895 in Philadelphia. The charge was murder, specifically, the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, though everyone in that courtroom knew the Pitzel children's ghosts sat alongside him. The prosecution couldn't try Holmes for those deaths in Pennsylvania, but their evidence and testimony would paint a picture of a serial killer who'd finally been caught. The courthouse was a circus. Journalists packed the gallery, sketching furiously, taking notes for stories that would sell out newspapers across the country. True crime was becoming a genre, and Holmes was its first celebrity monster. People lined up before dawn hoping for a seat, wanting to see the devil in person, needing to understand how a man could look so normal while being so monstrous. Holmes himself seemed to enjoy the attention. He dressed impeccably, his mustache perfectly groomed, his manner calm and collected. He smiled at journalists, nodded politely to spectators, behaved like a man attending a social event rather than a murder trial. This was his final stage, and he intended to perform. His defense strategy was simple: deny everything. The insurance scheme, a misunderstanding. Pitzel's death, a tragic accident that Holmes had tried to exploit for financial gain, yes, but not murder. The children, he'd left them with various caretakers during his travels. They must have met with foul play after leaving his care. He was a con man, perhaps a swindler and a fraud, but not a killer. It was a lie so bold it bordered on insulting. The prosecution had receipts for tools Holmes had purchased before the children disappeared. They had testimony from neighbors who'd seen him digging in basements. They had the bodies, small and heartbreaking, presented as evidence that would make the jury weep. They had Alice's letters, read aloud in court, her cheerful voice from beyond the grave describing her final days with a man who was already planning her death. The courtroom listened to Detective Frank Geyer describe finding the children's bodies. Strong men wept openly. Women in the gallery covered their faces. The horror was too immense, too cruel, too intimate. These weren't nameless victims. These were children with personalities and dreams and letters home to their mother. Children who died afraid and confused, betrayed by a man they trusted. The prosecution called witness after witness, building an airtight case. They brought in experts to discuss the chloroform bottles found in Holmes's possession. They presented evidence of the insurance fraud, showing how Holmes had carefully planned to kill Pitezel from the beginning. They brought in former associates who testified about Holmes's cold demeanor, his casual attitude toward death, his willingness to lie about anything. Holmes's attorneys did their best, but they were fighting against reality itself. Cross-examination couldn't explain away the bodies. Legal technicalities couldn't erase the evidence. Holmes's charm, so effective in private conversations, couldn't seduce an entire jury when stacked against the weight of child-sized coffins. The defense tried to paint Holmes as a man driven by desperation, by debts and circumstances beyond his control. They suggested that perhaps Pitezel had committed suicide, that the children's deaths were tragedies unconnected to their client. They argued reasonable doubt, technicalities, alternative explanations. But reason doesn't apply when children are involved. The jury looked at the evidence and saw a monster. The verdict was never in question. During the trial, more information about the castle emerged. Chicago investigators continued their excavation of the building on 63rd Street, uncovering new horrors with each passing day. They found more remains, more evidence of systematic murder. They interviewed former employees and neighbors, building a timeline of disappearances that coincided with Holmes's occupancy. The newspapers published detailed diagrams of the castle's layout, showing readers the secret passages and death chambers. They ran sensational stories about the murder castle and its architect of death, speculating about victims whose names would never be known, whose families would never find closure. One revelation particularly chilled the public. Holmes had sold some victim skeletons to medical schools. He'd reduced human beings to merchandise, stripping flesh from bone with professional efficiency, articulating the skeletons with wire and mounting them on stands, shipping them off as anatomical specimens. Some medical students had spent months studying the bones of murder victims, completely unaware they were handling evidence of Holmes's crimes. The prosecution wanted to bring Chicago witnesses to testify about the castle and its victims, to show the jury the full scope of Holmes's murderous career. The defense objected. Pitezel's murder was the charge, not these other deaths. The judge, sympathetic but constrained by law, limited testimony about the castle. The focus had to remain on Pennsylvania, on Benjamin Pitezel, on a crime the state had jurisdiction to prosecute. Still, everyone knew. The jury knew. The judge knew. The spectators knew. Holmes wasn't on trial for one murder. He was on trial for an entire carnival of death, even if legal technicalities prevented explicit discussion. Holmes himself finally took the stand, a decision his attorneys likely regretted. He was confident, articulate, maintaining his innocence with the same earnest sincerity he'd used to convince Pitezel to trust him, to convince women to follow him to soundproofed rooms, to convince the world he was Dr. Henry Howard Holmes instead of Herman Mudgett, failed medical student and compulsive liar. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. They walked Holmes through every lie, every contradiction, every impossible coincidence in his story. How could he have left the children with caretakers whose names he couldn't remember? Why had he purchased lime and tools? Why had he rented houses he never lived in? Why? Holmes's answers became increasingly convoluted, his charm failing under sustained questioning. He contradicted himself, invented new details, tried to explain away damning evidence with elaborate scenarios that made no logical sense. The mask slipped, and underneath, the jury glimpsed something cold and reptilian, something fundamentally wrong. The closing arguments were predictable. The prosecution painted Holmes as evil incarnate, a predator who targeted the vulnerable, who'd killed children for money, who deserved no mercy. The defense pleaded for reason, for doubt, for any crack in the prosecution's case that might save their client's life. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Herman Webster Mudgett guilty of murder in the first degree. Holmes showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He nodded slightly, as if confirming an expected outcome, then smiled at his attorneys. That smile would be reported in newspapers across the country. The killer's final performance, showing the world he didn't care, that nothing touched him, that he remained in control even in defeat. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. Holmes accepted the sentence calmly, thanked the court for its attention, and returned to his cell. He would have months to wait while appeals were filed and rejected, months to contemplate his fate or, more likely, to continue spinning lies for anyone willing to listen. Because that's what Holmes did during his remaining time. He talked. He gave interviews to journalists, selling his story for money that he'd never have time to spend. He wrote a confession, published in a Philadelphia newspaper, where he claimed responsibility for 27 murders. Then he recanted, saying he'd only killed 2 people. Then he changed the story again. The confession itself was a masterpiece of manipulation and lies. Holmes described murders that likely never happened while omitting ones that certainly did. He painted himself alternately as a victim of circumstance, a man driven to kill by outside forces, or as a monster born evil, cursed from birth. He seemed unable to settle on a single narrative, perhaps because the truth, that he'd killed for profit and pleasure, methodically and without remorse, was too simple, too honest, too devoid of the drama he craved. Some of his claims were obviously false. He suggested that his face had changed due to his crimes, that he was becoming physically demonic, sprouting the appearance to match his soul. Newspapers published side-by-side photographs showing no change whatsoever. Holmes looked exactly as he always had, which was somehow worse. The banality of his evil, the normalcy of his appearance, made the horror more acute. He wrote letters to Carrie Pitzel, the woman whose husband and children he'd murdered, offering bizarre apologies and excuses. He seemed genuinely baffled by her hatred of him, unable to understand why she wouldn't accept his explanations. His sociopathy was so complete, he couldn't grasp the emotional devastation he'd inflicted. Carrie Pitzel, for her part, had survived losing a husband and 3 children to become one of the trial's most tragic figures. She attended the proceedings, listening to descriptions of how her babies had died, hearing her daughter's letters read aloud, learning that every promise Holmes had made was a lie. She wept silently through most of the testimony, a woman destroyed by trusting the wrong person. The public sympathy for her was immense, matched only by their hatred of Holmes. Letters poured into Philadelphia demanding his execution. Some suggested more creative punishments: burning, drawing, and quartering, slow death by the same methods he'd inflicted on his victims. The bloodlust was intense, a collective rage at a man who'd killed children and smiled about it. Holmes's execution was scheduled for May 7, 1896. As the date approached, he gave final interviews, still spinning stories, still performing. He claimed to regret his crimes but seemed most upset about being caught. He spoke about the children almost casually, as if their deaths were unfortunate business decisions rather than moral catastrophes. His attorneys made last-minute appeals, arguing technicalities and procedure. All were rejected. Pennsylvania wanted Holmes dead, and the law would grant that wish. The night before his execution, Holmes requested a Catholic priest, suddenly finding religion in his final hours. Though whether this was genuine spiritual awakening or one last performance remained unclear. He made a confession to the priest, the contents of which were never disclosed, protected by the sanctity of the confessional. Some claimed he admitted to even more murders. Others suggested he maintained his innocence to the end. The priest never said, taking Holmes's final words to the grave. Holmes ate a hearty final meal, slept reasonably well according to guards, and woke on execution day with apparent calm. He dressed carefully, groomed his mustache one last time, and prepared to face death with the same theatrical composure he'd brought to everything else in his life. The execution was scheduled for 10:12 a.m. at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. A crowd gathered outside the prison walls, hundreds of people wanting to witness justice, to know the monster was truly dead. Inside, a select group of witnesses, officials, journalists, law enforcement, assembled to watch the hanging. Holmes walked to the gallows without assistance, his step steady. He addressed the witnesses, giving a brief speech in which he maintained that he'd only killed 2 people and that newspaper accounts were exaggerated. It was a lie delivered with absolute sincerity. One final con for the audience. He had one strange final request. He asked that his coffin be filled with cement after his burial, that his grave be dug extra deep, that his body be protected from grave robbers who might try to steal it for medical display. This from a man who'd sold his victims' skeletons to medical schools. The irony was lost on no one. The noose was placed around his neck, the hood pulled over his face. Holmes stood on the trapdoor, waiting for the mechanism to drop him into eternity. He reportedly said a final prayer, though the words were inaudible to witnesses. But death, even death, wouldn't let Holmes exit cleanly. The mechanism was triggered. The trapdoor opened. Holmes fell. But the drop didn't break his neck as intended. The rope length had been miscalculated. Instead of instant death, Holmes strangled slowly, his body twitching and convulsing for 15 agonizing minutes while witnesses watched in horror. It was a gruesome, ugly death, lacking any dignity or mercy. Some said it was fitting that a man who'd inflicted so much suffering deserved to suffer himself. Others called it a travesty, a failure of professional execution that reduced a legal proceeding to barbarism. Holmes died at 10:27 a.m. on May 7, 1896. His body was cut down, placed in a coffin, and buried according to his wishes, deep in the earth, encased in cement, as if concrete could contain the evil he'd embodied. His death didn't bring peace. The castle still stood in Chicago, a monument to murder that no one knew what to do with. Its owner was dead, but the building remained, full of secret passages and death chambers and ghosts that wouldn't rest. After Holmes's execution, the castle on 63rd Street became Chicago's most infamous landmark. Tourists flocked to see the murder castle, standing outside taking photographs, peering through windows, hoping to glimpse some evidence of the horrors that had occurred inside. The building had become a grotesque attraction, a piece of true crime history that people couldn't resist examining. But the castle kept its secrets jealously. The Chicago police had excavated the basement, removed the most obvious evidence, and documented the building's strange architecture. They'd found remains, bone fragments, teeth, personal effects, but nothing like a complete accounting of Holmes's victims. The building had done its job too well, efficiently processing bodies into ashen fragments, erasing identities, turning people into anonymous organic matter. The property remained in a legal tangle. Holmes had mortgaged it multiple times, each lender believing they held primary claim. The building's value was uncertain. Who wanted to own a murder factory? Creditors fought over the scraps of Holmes's estate while the castle sat empty, a hulking reminder of what had happened within its walls. Some investigators weren't satisfied with the official body count. Detective Geyer, haunted by what he'd found in Indianapolis and Toronto, believed there were more victims, many more. He continued interviewing witnesses, tracking down missing persons cases from Chicago during the World's Fair years, trying to match disappearances with Holmes's timeline. The numbers grew disturbing. Dozens of young women had vanished from the Englewood neighborhood between 1890 and 1894. Most were single, working class, without family in the city to report them missing or push for investigations. They'd simply disappeared, swallowed by Chicago's vastness, written off as girls who'd moved on or fallen into prostitution or met with some unspecified bad end. How many had actually walked through the castle's doors and never left? Geyer interviewed former employees who'd worked in the building's ground floor businesses. They remembered a constant turnover of tenants in the upper floors, young women who'd rent rooms for a week or a month and then vanish. Holmes always had explanations. They'd moved to different neighborhoods, gone back home, found employment elsewhere. The employees had no reason to question these stories at the time, but looking back, the pattern was chilling. One former clerk remembered a young woman named Emily Van Tassel who'd worked briefly in the castle's drugstore. She'd been bright and cheerful, engaged to be married. Then suddenly she stopped coming to work. Holmes said she'd eloped with a traveling salesman, running off without notice. Romantic, if inconsiderate. The clerk had believed it. Now, knowing what Holmes was capable of, that explanation took on sinister implications. Was Emily Van Tassel another victim? Her family had filed a missing persons report, but Chicago police in the 1890s were overwhelmed, and single women disappeared frequently enough that individual cases rarely received serious investigation. The report gathered dust in a filing cabinet while Emily, if she'd indeed been murdered, became smoke and bone meal, just another ghost in the castle's walls. Detective Geyer compiled a list of possible victims based on missing persons reports, witness testimony, and personal effects found in the castle's debris. The list grew to over 50 names, though proof was impossible for most. Bodies were gone, records were incomplete, and Holmes had taken his secrets to the grave. Some families got closure, grim as it was. A locket found in the castle's basement was identified by a missing woman's sister. Their mother's cameo, something the victim always wore. Clothing fragments matched descriptions from other reports. Jewelry surfaced in pawn shops, traced back to Holmes's sales, identified by grieving relatives as belonging to daughters and sisters who'd disappeared. But closure is cold comfort when the details are so horrible. Families learned their loved ones had died terrified and alone, betrayed by a man they trusted, their bodies destroyed with industrial efficiency. Some wished they'd never learned the truth, preferring uncertainty to the knowledge of how their daughters or sisters had spent their final moments. The castle itself became a problem. Vandals broke in, stealing souvenirs and damaging what remained. Curiosity seekers bribed their way inside, wandering through rooms where women had died, treating the building like a macabre museum. The neighborhood wanted it gone. Property values were suffering, and the constant attention was exhausting. But destroying the castle proved complicated. The legal battles over ownership dragged on, with multiple parties claiming rights to the property. Meanwhile, the building stood empty, windows broken, a monument to evil that Chicago couldn't exorcise. Then, in August 1895, while Holmes awaited execution, the problem solved itself. Fire broke out in the castle one night, flames visible for miles across Chicago's south side. The building burned with extraordinary intensity, the blaze spreading faster than fire should through a structure that size. Firefighters responded but could do little. The flames seemed to have engulfed the entire building simultaneously, as if multiple fires had started at once. By morning, the castle was gone. Only the ground floor's outer walls remained, blackened and structuring, everything else reduced to rubble and ash. The fire's cause was listed as unknown, though arson was suspected. Who said it? A family member seeking to destroy the place where their loved one died. A neighbor tired of living next to infamy? Someone hired by creditors who wanted the property cleared? Or maybe the castle itself, tired of carrying Holmes's evil, had simply chosen to burn. The rubble was cleared. The lot eventually sold. A post office was built on the site, deliberately, some said, placing a symbol of government order and communication where murder had once flourished. The location's dark history was noted in records but not advertised. The mail carriers who worked there probably never knew they were sorting letters where women had died screaming. But Chicago didn't forget. Stories circulated about the castle and its victims, growing more lurid with each retelling. The number of victims inflated in urban legend. Some claimed Holmes had killed over 200 people, though this was almost certainly exaggerated. The actual count was probably between 20 and 50, still horrifying but less sensational than the mythology suggested. Holmes himself became a figure of dark fascination in American culture. He was the prototype for the serial killer, the original monster in human form, predating the term serial killer by decades. Writers and journalists analyzed him, trying to understand what created such a creature. Was he born evil? Made evil by circumstance? Could anyone have predicted what he would become? Psychologists, a relatively new profession, studied Holmes's case file with intense interest. Here was a man with no apparent conscience, someone who could murder repeatedly without remorse, who could lie without hesitation, who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded. They had no proper diagnosis for what he was, wouldn't develop the concept of psychopathy for years to come, but they recognized that Holmes represented something fundamentally broken in human psychology. His childhood was examined for clues. The abuse from his father, the poverty, the early cruelty to animals. All classic warning signs, though no one had recognized them as such at the time. But plenty of people endured difficult childhoods without becoming serial killers. What specifically had gone wrong with Herman Webster Mudgett? The answer seemed to be everything and nothing. He was born without the capacity for empathy, raised in circumstances that reinforced cruelty, and intelligent enough to hide his true nature from the world. He'd learned early that lying was effective, that people believed what they wanted to believe, that a charming smile opened doors that honesty couldn't. And he'd discovered that murder was easy if you were careful, that bodies could disappear, that consequences could be avoided through cleverness and misdirection. Each successful crime had reinforced the behavior, teaching him that he was smarter than everyone else, that rules didn't apply to him, that he could get away with anything. Until he couldn't. Until arrogance led to mistakes. Until the Pitezel family's destruction brought enough attention that even Holmes's silver tongue couldn't talk his way free. Until Detective Geyer's persistence uncovered the truth. Some of Holmes's victims were eventually identified through the efforts of families who refused to stop searching. Emmeline Segran's relatives recognized her belongings among evidence catalogs. Minnie Williams's properties were traced back through Holmes's fraudulent transfers. Julia Smythe's disappearance was finally connected to Holmes's timeline, but most remained nameless. Young women who'd come to Chicago seeking opportunity, who'd trusted the wrong man, who died in soundproofed rooms with no one to hear their screams. They became Jane Does in police files, unidentified bone fragments in evidence boxes, ghosts haunting the imagination of a city that had failed to protect them. The question of why haunted everyone who studied the case. Why had Holmes killed so many? The insurance frauds made financial sense, however twisted. He murdered for profit, eliminating witnesses and collecting payouts. But what about the women in the castle? Many had no insurance policies, no wealth to steal. Some he'd even spent money on, courting them with dinners and gifts before killing them. The answer seemed to be that Holmes killed because he enjoyed it. The financial motivations were rationalizations, excuses that gave his murders a veneer of purpose. But the truth was simpler and more horrible. He liked hurting people. He liked the power, the control, the godlike authority over life and death. He killed because he wanted to, because he could, because something in his brain found satisfaction in others' suffering. This realization was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Americans in the 1890s understood murder driven by passion, by greed, by revenge. Those motives were comprehensible, however criminal. But murder as recreation? Killing as a hobby? That suggested a type of evil that society wasn't equipped to process. Holmes changed how America thought about crime. Before him, murderers were seen as people who'd been pushed to extreme acts by circumstances. After Holmes, people understood that monsters could wear human faces, that evil could be banal and charming, that some people killed simply because they wanted to. He influenced literature and culture for generations. Fictional serial killers descended directly from Holmes. The intelligent, charming predator who hides in plain sight became a standard character type. Every smooth-talking villain who gains victims' trust before betraying them owes something to H.H. Holmes. The castle's design influenced crime fiction as well. The idea of a building specifically created for murder, with secret passages and death chambers, became a recurring trope. Horror writers borrowed Holmes's architecture, creating their own nightmarish structures where walls had sinister purposes and rooms concealed deadly functions. But the real castle, or what it represented, was more terrifying than any fiction. It was proof that someone could plan murders with the same careful attention others gave to legitimate business. That death could be industrialized, systematized, turned into an efficient process. That evil could be organized and methodical rather than passionate and chaotic. The Englewood neighborhood where the castle stood eventually recovered, though the shadow lingered. Families moved in, businesses opened, life continued. The lot where Holmes's murder factory had stood became just another Chicago address, notable only to historians and true crime enthusiasts who made pilgrimages to stand where the building once loomed. Some claimed the location was haunted, that ghostly figures appeared in photographs, that strange sounds echoed from the post office basement. These stories were almost certainly nonsense, grief and imagination creating supernatural explanations for purely human evil. The ghosts weren't in the ground. They were in the records, in the missing persons files, in the families that still carried the absence of loved ones lost to Holmes's appetite for death. Detective Frank Geyer, the man who'd tracked Holmes across multiple states and found the Pitzel children's bodies, was changed by the case. He continued his career in law enforcement but never forgot the small coffins, the shallow graves, the letters from Alice Pitzel describing her journey toward death with a trusting girl's optimism. He'd looked evil directly in the face and seen it smile back at him. Geyer wrote a book about the investigation, documenting his search for the children and the evidence that finally brought Holmes to justice. The book was a bestseller, feeding America's appetite for true crime stories. But for Geyer, it wasn't entertainment. It was testimony, a record of what happened so that the victims wouldn't be forgotten, so that their deaths would mean something beyond serving Holmes's appetite. Carrie Pitzel, the mother who'd lost everything, survived into old age, carrying her grief like physical weight. She never remarried, never recovered from the betrayal and loss. She trusted Holmes because her husband had trusted him, and that trust had cost her 5 of the 6 people she loved most. She lived with that knowledge every day, a sentence worse than any court could impose. The remaining Pitzel children, the 2 who'd stayed with Carrie during Holmes's final rampage, grew up knowing their siblings had been murdered, that their father had been killed for insurance money, that a trusted family friend had been a monster. That knowledge shaped their lives, casting shadows over every relationship, making trust difficult, turning their childhood into a minefield of trauma. In 1914, 18 years after Holmes's execution, a woman came forward claiming to be one of his daughters. She said her mother had been one of Holmes's many unofficial wives, that she'd been born during his murder castle years, that she'd only recently learned who her father truly was. Whether her claim was legitimate or opportunistic was never firmly established. Holmes had left behind so many lies, so many false identities and abandoned families, that unraveling the truth was nearly impossible. What is certain is that Holmes's evil rippled outward, damaging lives far beyond his direct victims. The families who never found their missing daughters. The investigators traumatized by what they discovered. The neighborhood scarred by proximity to horror. The collective loss of innocence as Americans realized monsters weren't just fairy tale creations. They walked among us, smiling and charming and absolutely deadly. The castle burned, but its legacy endured. Every missing person case afterward carried the shadow of Holmes's crimes. Every charming stranger became slightly suspect. Every basement was a potential grave. Holmes had changed the cultural landscape, introducing a new kind of fear into American consciousness, the fear that normal-seeming people might be hiding monstrous intentions. Over a century later, Holmes remains a subject of fascination. Books continue to be written about him. Documentaries examine his crimes. His name appears in discussions of serial killers, usually as the original, the template from which others descended. The murder castle, though long destroyed, lives on in imagination, a structure so perfectly designed for evil that it seems almost mythological. But he was real. The castle was real. The women who died there were real, with names and families and futures that were stolen from them. The Pitzel children were real, 3 innocent kids who died afraid because their parents trusted the wrong person. The horror wasn't supernatural or mythological. It was absolutely, terribly human. Holmes proved that evil doesn't need fangs or claws. It just needs charm, intelligence, and the complete absence of conscience. He showed that monsters wear tailored suits and speak politely, that they run pharmacies and smile at customers, that they're impossible to identify until it's far too late. The building is gone, reduced to ash and then to memory. The man is gone, his body rotting in cement-filled coffin deep underground. But what they represented, the capacity for calculated, systematic evil disguised by normalcy, remains. Holmes was America's first known serial killer, but he wouldn't be the last. The murder castle was a unique creation, but the mentality that built it lives on in those who see other people as objects to be used and discarded. Tonight, you've walked through the castle's halls, metaphorically speaking. You've seen what Holmes built and understood what it was designed to do. You've learned the names of some victims and mourned the many who remain nameless. You've witnessed how easily people can be deceived when they want to believe, when circumstances make them vulnerable, when a monster offers exactly what they need. The lesson isn't just about history. It's about vigilance, about questioning too good to be true offers, about trusting instincts that whisper warnings. It's about remembering that evil often looks ordinary, sounds reasonable, presents itself as help or opportunity or love. The castle fell over a century ago, but its shadow stretches into the present. Every time someone goes missing, every time a charming stranger's story doesn't quite add up, every time evil hides behind a smile, that's Holmes's legacy. That's the murder castle, rebuilt in the minds of those who remember that monsters are real and they look just like everyone else. The hunt is over. The monster is dead. But the darkness he represented never truly goes away. It just finds new faces, new methods, new victims who don't realize they're walking into carefully constructed traps until the door locks behind them. Sleep carefully, knowing that horror doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it knocks politely at your door, offering shelter from the storm, wearing its very best smile. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4: The Monster of the Andes, Pedro Lopez. Tonight, we descend into the mind of a predator who claimed over 300 souls before the world even knew his name. This is the story of Pedro Alonso Lopez, the man who turned Colombia's mountains into a graveyard, Ecuador's valleys into hunting grounds, and Peru's forgotten corners into chambers of unspeakable horror. They called him the Monster of the Andes. But monsters are myths. Pedro Lopez was terrifyingly, devastatingly real. And when they finally caught him, he smiled. He smiled because he knew something the rest of us could never stomach, that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it walks in broad daylight, wearing a human face, whispering to children, and the world simply looks away. This is that story, the one that will make you question every stranger's smile, every kind word offered to a child alone. Welcome to the nightmare. The rain hammered against the tin roof of the brothel where Pedro Alonso Lopez took his first breath on October 8, 1948. Tolima, Colombia, a place where poverty wore the landscape like a second skin, where desperation seeped into the cracks of every broken home, every forgotten street corner. His mother, Benilda Lopez de Castaneda, was a sex worker trying to survive in a world that had already chewed her up and spit her out 13 times before. Pedro was her 13th child, unlucky number 13, born into chaos, born into a home where love was rationed and violence was the common language. But Pedro's story doesn't begin with his birth. It begins with what happened after, with what was done to him, with what he would become. Benilda ran her brothel from the same home where she raised her children, if you could call it raising. The walls were thin. Everything was audible. The sounds of her work penetrated every corner of that house, seeping into young Pedro's developing consciousness like poison into groundwater. At 8 years old, he walked into a room and saw his mother with a client. Most children would be traumatized into silence. Pedro reacted differently. He watched, and when Benilda discovered him there, frozen in the doorway, she didn't comfort him. She didn't explain. She exploded. "Get out!" she screamed, her face twisted with rage and shame. "Get out and never come back." She threw him into the street like garbage. 8 years old, alone. The door slammed behind him, and that sound, that final, definitive sound, would echo through every murder he would commit. Some people trace their damage back to a moment. For Pedro Lopez, this was his genesis. This was the crack in reality that let the monster through. The streets of Tolima swallowed him whole. An 8-year-old boy with nowhere to go, no one to turn to, nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing, gnawing rage in his belly. He slept in doorways. He ate from garbage heaps. He learned quickly that the world had no mercy for children like him. That kindness was a fairy tale told to kids who had homes to return to. Pedro had nothing, so he became nothing, a ghost haunting the margins of society. Then came the man. Pedro never remembered his name, didn't want to, but he remembered everything else. The kind smile, the offer of food, the promise of safety, how desperately Pedro wanted to believe it, how hungry he was not just for food, but for something resembling human care. The man took him to a deserted building, fed him, gave him a blanket, and then, when Pedro's guard was finally down, when he'd allowed himself the dangerous luxury of trust, the man raped him, repeatedly, for days. The details are almost too horrific to voice, but they matter. They matter because this is where Pedro Lopez, the victim, became Pedro Lopez, the predator. This is where his sexuality twisted into something unrecognizable, where his understanding of human connection warped into an equation of power and pain. The man who assaulted him didn't just steal his innocence, he rewired his brain. He created a new neural pathway where sexual gratification became inextricably linked with domination, with violence, with the act of destroying something pure. When Pedro finally escaped, he wasn't the same child who'd been thrown into the street. That boy was dead. What crawled back into the world was something else entirely. Something colder. Something capable of compartmentalizing suffering in ways that would later allow him to look into the eyes of dying children and feel nothing but satisfaction. But Pedro was still just a child himself. Still vulnerable. Still searching for survival in a world designed to crush people like him. He drifted through Colombia's streets, learning the brutal mathematics of poverty. Stealing to eat, fighting to survive, building walls around whatever remained of his humanity, brick by bitter brick. At 12 years old, another stranger approached him, another kind face, another offer. This time, Pedro's instincts screamed danger, but desperation muted them. He was so tired of being hungry, so tired of sleeping in filth, so tired of fighting just to see another sunrise. This new man seemed different, official even. He claimed to work with a family, an American family looking for help on their property. Good work, regular meals, a bed. Pedro went. The family existed. They were wealthy, connected, comfortable in ways Pedro couldn't comprehend. They took him in as household help, a common arrangement in Colombia, where poverty created an endless supply of disposable children. For a while, it almost seemed like salvation. 3 meals a day, a roof that didn't leak, work that was hard but manageable. But Pedro's past had taught him that safety was an illusion, that every kindness had a price. He was right. At 18 years old, after 6 years in that household, Pedro was accused of stealing. The details remain murky. He would later claim he was innocent, framed by someone who wanted him gone. Whether true or fabricated, the accusation landed him in prison. His first taste of the Colombian penal system. His first immersion in a world where violence wasn't just accepted, it was currency. The prison was a concrete hell where the strong preyed on the weak, where respect was earned through brutality, where every day was a test of your willingness to become something monstrous just to survive. Pedro was young, relatively small, with a target painted on his back from day one. The other inmates circled him like sharks scenting blood. They raped him, multiple men, over and over, reasserting the lesson that had been carved into him as a child. You are prey. You are nothing. You exist only to be used and discarded. But something shifted during those assaults. Something fundamental and terrible. Pedro didn't just endure the violence. He internalized it. He studied it. He understood with crystal clarity that the world operated on a simple principle, predator or prey. There was no middle ground, no third option. You either dominated or were dominated. You either inflicted suffering or absorbed it. Pedro decided he would never be prey again. He fashioned a crude weapon from materials scavenged around the prison. Sharpened metal, wrapped handle, nothing fancy, but effective enough. He waited for the next assault. When it came, when the men who'd been victimizing him approached with that familiar predatory confidence, Pedro struck. He killed them, not just one, all four, stabbed them repeatedly, far beyond what was necessary for self-defense. He transformed the act into something ritualistic, something that felt, for the first time in his miserable life, like power. The prison authorities investigated, of course. But this was Colombia in the 1960s. Prison violence was common. For inmates dead, killed by another inmate who claimed self-defense after repeated sexual assaults, the investigation was perfunctory at best. Pedro served additional time for the killings, but the psychological impact was profound. He crossed a line. He'd discovered that taking life wasn't just possible, it was intoxicating. It filled a void inside him that nothing else could touch. When Pedro Lopez walked out of prison in 1969, he was 21 years old. He'd spent his entire life being victimized, brutalized, taught that human beings were either predators or prey. He'd been raped as a child, raped in prison, thrown away by his own mother, abandoned by every system that should have protected him. The world had spent 2 decades teaching Pedro Lopez that human life had no value, that suffering was meaningless, that power came from inflicting pain. He'd learned the lesson well, too well. The man who emerged from that prison wasn't seeking redemption or rehabilitation. He wasn't looking to rebuild his life or find connection or heal his wounds. Pedro Lopez left prison with a singular purpose crystallizing in his mind like ice forming on glass. He would never be powerless again. He would never be prey again. And if the world insisted on teaching him that human beings were disposable, well, he would prove just how right that lesson was. He would become the predator, the ultimate predator, and his hunting ground would be the forgotten children of South America, the ones who reminded him of himself. The vulnerable, the abandoned, the ones nobody protected because nobody cared. He would do to them what had been done to him, but he would retain control. He would hold the power. He would be the one who decided when the suffering ended. The monster of the Andes was born, not in a moment, but in 1,000 small cruelties accumulated over 21 years. Not from some genetic abnormality or brain defect, but from a systematic destruction of empathy, piece by piece, until nothing remained but hunger. And Pedro Lopez was very, very hungry. Pedro Lopez began his rampage in Peru. The year was 1969, and he was a drifter, moving through the Andean regions like smoke, present but intangible, there one moment and gone the next. He'd perfected the art of invisibility, of blending into the margins where nobody looked too closely. The poor regions of South America were perfect for someone like him. Children disappeared all the time. Poor children, indigenous children, children whose parents worked dawn to dusk just to afford another meal. Children who could vanish without triggering investigations or news coverage or any meaningful response from authorities. Pedro knew this. He counted on it. His method was refined through practice, through trial and error, through a growing understanding of human psychology. He would target tribal communities first, isolated areas where traditional structures meant less interaction with modern law enforcement, where girls were sometimes viewed as less valuable than boys, where superstition might explain a disappearance before police involvement was even considered. He'd enter these communities as a transient, someone passing through, harmless and unremarkable, just another face in the endless parade of poverty. Then he'd watch. He'd observe the patterns. Which children walked alone, which families were too large to notice one missing for a few hours, which girls were already marginalized, already vulnerable, already forgotten even before they disappeared. Pedro had a type: girls between 8 and 12 years old. The age range wasn't random. These were children old enough to be left alone, unsupervised, but young enough to be easily controlled. Old enough to represent something to Pedro, an echo of his own lost childhood, perhaps, or a manifestation of his mother who'd rejected him. Young enough to be overpowered, manipulated, destroyed. His approach was sickeningly consistent. He'd present himself as friendly, trustworthy. He'd offer food or money or help finding something. He'd exploit the natural trust that some children still possessed, despite living in harsh conditions. Or he'd simply wait until nightfall and take them by force, grabbing them from paths they walked daily, from the edges of their communities, from anywhere he could strike quickly and disappear into the darkness. What happened next is almost unbearable to describe. Pedro would take these girls to prepared locations, caves, abandoned buildings, isolated forest clearings, places where screams wouldn't carry, where nobody would interrupt. He'd rape them, and after the rape, after he'd satisfied whatever twisted compulsion drove him, he'd kill them. Strangulation was his preferred method. He'd watch the light leave their eyes, feel their struggles weaken and stop, experience that ultimate expression of power, the ability to extinguish a human life with his bare hands. But here's what makes Pedro Lopez particularly terrifying. He wasn't frenzied. He wasn't out of control. This wasn't the work of someone who'd snapped under pressure or suffered a psychotic break. Pedro approached murder with methodical precision. He'd established rituals. After killing his victims, he'd sometimes spend time with the bodies, positioning them, looking at them, extracting whatever psychological satisfaction he derived from viewing his work. Some reports suggest he'd return to burial sites, digging up remains to spend more time with them. This wasn't just about the act of killing, it was about ownership, about having something that belonged entirely to him, about possessing these lives completely, even in death. The tribes in Peru began noticing. Children were disappearing, not one or two, but dozens. Enough that even in communities where child mortality was tragically common, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Whispers spread, stories of a stranger, a man seen near communities before girls vanished. Fear rippled through the indigenous populations, the kind of fear that lives in the bones, that changes behavior, that makes parents grip their children tighter. The tribal leaders started searching, organizing. They put together hunting parties, groups of men who'd spent lifetimes tracking animals through dense forest and treacherous mountain terrain. They were looking for Pedro Lopez, though they didn't know his name. They were looking for the shadow that had been stealing their children. They found him. Details of his capture by the tribe are sparse, filtered through multiple retellings and translations. But the core facts are chilling. They caught him mid-attack, caught him in the act of trying to abduct another girl. The men descended on him with the fury of parents who'd lost children, of communities that had been terrorized. They beat him, bound him, prepared to execute him in the traditional way, burial alive, some sources claim, or burning. Justice delivered by the community he'd violated. Pedro Lopez was hours from death when fate intervened. An American missionary stumbled upon the scene, saw a man being prepared for execution by a group of indigenous people, and made a catastrophic decision. She intervened, convinced the tribe to turn Pedro over to Peruvian authorities instead of killing him. She believed in law, in order, in the system. She believed that official justice was superior to tribal retribution. She couldn't have been more wrong. The Peruvian police took custody of Pedro Lopez. They charged him with cattle theft, not murder, not kidnapping, not child rape, cattle theft. The accusations from the tribes about missing children were either not believed, not investigated, or simply not prioritized. Pedro was a nobody. The victims were indigenous children from remote areas. The bureaucracy couldn't be bothered with a complex investigation when a simple property crime charge would suffice. He served a brief sentence, months, not years, and was then deported. Not imprisoned for life, not executed, just removed, sent across the border into Ecuador like garbage being hauled to a new dump. Ecuador welcomed him with open arms. Not deliberately, of course, but by failing to track him, failing to investigate his background, failing to recognize the predator in their midst, they might as well have rolled out the red carpet. Pedro Lopez had been caught, had been hours from execution, had been given a second chance by a well-meaning missionary who thought she was saving a life. She'd saved a monster instead, and now that monster was hunting in new territory. Ecuador became Pedro's primary killing field. He moved through the country like a plague, concentrating his activities in the poorer regions, the places where government oversight was minimal and law enforcement was stretched too thin to investigate every missing child. Ambato, Quito, Cuenca, cities and towns that would later discover they'd been hosting one of history's most prolific serial killers without even knowing he existed. Pedro refined his methods further. He became more careful, more strategic. He'd learned from his close call in Peru. He varied his patterns to avoid detection. He'd strike in one area, then move to another. He'd change his appearance slightly, grow his hair or cut it, add a mustache or shave it off. Nothing dramatic enough to make him memorable, but enough to prevent witnesses from giving consistent descriptions. And the victims accumulated. 10 became 20, 20 became 50, 50 became 100. Little girls who'd been alive one moment, playing, laughing, dreaming of futures they'd never see, were transformed into statistics, into bodies buried in shallow graves scattered across Ecuador's landscape, into names their parents would scream into the void, hoping for answers that would never come. Pedro developed what he would later describe as a routine. He'd wake up with the intention to kill. He'd go hunting for victims. He'd find one, abduct her, assault her, murder her, dispose of the body, and then continue his day as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed a family, as if he hadn't just erased a human life. He'd eat a meal, maybe have a drink, sleep soundly, then wake up the next day and do it again. The psychological detachment required for this level of violence is almost incomprehensible. Pedro Lopez didn't kill in fits of rage. He didn't murder because he lost control. He killed because it had become his purpose, his identity, the thing that gave his life meaning. He'd been destroyed as a child, piece by piece, and now he was returning that destruction to the world, methodically, relentlessly, without remorse. But Ecuador's law enforcement was finally starting to notice patterns. Reports of missing girls were piling up, enough that even in a country struggling with poverty, corruption, and limited resources, the sheer number of disappearances was triggering alarm. Investigators began comparing notes, looking for connections. They didn't have forensic technology or databases or sophisticated tracking systems, but they had dedicated officers who saw the pattern emerging: girls of similar ages, similar backgrounds, disappearing from similar circumstances across multiple regions. Something was hunting in Ecuador. Something that left no witnesses, no evidence, no trails to follow. Just absence. Just empty spaces where children used to be. Pedro Lopez was averaging 3 murders a week at his peak. 3 children per week, 12 per month, over 100 per year. The scale is almost impossible to process. The police were investigating missing persons cases while the perpetrator was actively creating new victims faster than they could document the old ones. It was like trying to bail water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon while someone was drilling new holes in the hull. Pedro would later claim he preferred to kill in Ecuador over Colombia because the girls in Ecuador were more gentle and innocent. He'd developed preferences. Like a connoisseur selecting wine, he was choosing victims based on perceived qualities. The banality of evil doesn't adequately describe this. Pedro Lopez had industrialized murder. He'd turned it into something routine, something productive, something he did with the same casual regularity other people brought to their jobs. And through it all, he remained invisible, a face in the crowd, a stranger passing through, nobody worth remembering, nobody worth investigating. He was camouflaged by poverty, by his unremarkable appearance, by a society that had learned to look away from its most vulnerable citizens. The system that should have stopped him after Peru instead delivered him to a fresh hunting ground. The warning signs that should have triggered investigations were dismissed or ignored. The pattern that should have been obvious was obscured by bureaucratic indifference and the tragic reality that poor children simply didn't matter enough to mobilize resources. Pedro Lopez was winning, completely, utterly, without challenge. He'd murdered over 100 girls in Ecuador alone. The precise number would later be revealed as even higher than authorities initially believed. Families were grieving, communities were terrified, and the monster responsible was living among them, shopping in their markets, walking their streets, smiling at their children. But every predator eventually makes a mistake. Every winning streak eventually ends. And Pedro Lopez, despite his methodical approach and careful planning, was about to discover that even monsters can be caught. The end was coming. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it was coming. March 9th, 1980, a date that would finally bring Pedro Lopez's nightmare to an end, though nobody knew it yet. The morning began like countless others for Maria Poveda, waking up early in the market town of Ambato, Ecuador, preparing for another day of selling goods to support her family. The market was her world, her livelihood, the place where she'd spent years building relationships with customers and fellow vendors. She knew the rhythms of the marketplace like she knew her own heartbeat. Every face, every routine, every pattern, which is why she noticed him immediately. Pedro Lopez stood at the edge of the market, watching. His eyes tracked the crowd with predatory focus, lingering on the young girls who wandered between stalls with their mothers or played near their families' shops. There was something wrong about his attention, something that made Maria's instincts flare. She'd heard the stories everyone had, whispers about missing girls, warnings passed between mothers, the general anxiety that had settled over Ecuador like fog, this sense that something terrible was happening even if nobody could name it precisely. She watched him, and he didn't notice. That was his first mistake. Pedro had gotten complacent, perhaps, or maybe he was simply so focused on potential victims that he failed to observe who might be observing him. Maria saw him approach a young girl, 12 years old, who'd wandered slightly away from her mother's stall. She watched him lean down, speak to the child, gesture toward the market's edge. The classic predator approach. Establish trust, create isolation, strike when the opportunity presents itself. But this time, the opportunity never came, because Maria was already moving. She grabbed her neighbor, another market vendor, and pointed toward Pedro. "That man," she hissed. "He's trying to take that girl. Get help. Now." The neighbor ran for the police while Maria did something incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on your perspective. She confronted Pedro directly, stepped between him and the girl, demanded to know what he was doing, who he was, where he thought he was taking this child. Pedro's face shifted. The friendly mask cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He tried to talk his way out, claimed he was the girl's uncle, made excuses, but Maria wasn't buying it, and by now other vendors had noticed the commotion. A crowd was forming. The girl's actual mother arrived, terrified and furious. And before Pedro could slip away into the crowd as he'd done so many times before, the police arrived. It should have ended there. Simple attempted abduction. But the police officers who responded to the market that day had been living with the mounting frustration of unsolved disappearances. They'd seen the reports. They'd attended the meetings where patterns were discussed but never resolved. And something about this man, this unremarkable drifter trying to abduct a child in broad daylight, triggered their instincts. They arrested him, not just for the attempted abduction, but with the intention of investigating further. They brought him to the station and began asking questions. "Who are you? Where are you from? Where have you been?" Standard procedure, but Pedro's answers were evasive, inconsistent, the kind of responses that make experienced investigators lean forward with interest. They held him while they dug deeper, checked with other departments, sent his description to police in other regions. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. Reports of a man matching his description seen in areas where girls had disappeared. Witnesses who'd noticed a stranger in town just before another child vanished. Nothing definitive, nothing that would hold up in court, but enough to justify holding him longer, enough to push harder. The interrogation stretched across days. Pedro remained calm at first, confident that he could talk his way out as he always had. But these investigators were different. They weren't giving up. They weren't moving on to easier cases. They sensed they'd caught something significant, even if they couldn't yet prove it. Then came the moment that broke everything open. One of the officers, Pastor Cordova, took a different approach. Instead of accusations, he presented empathy. He suggested they knew Pedro had suffered, that he'd been victimized, that he'd been hurt in ways that might explain his actions. It was a tactical move, a psychological technique designed to lower defenses. But it worked far better than Cordova could have anticipated. Pedro Lopez began to talk, not with remorse, not with shame, but with pride. He started describing his work, his methods, his victim selection process. He spoke about murder the way other men might discuss their careers, with professional detachment and satisfaction in a job well done. The officers sat frozen, scribbling notes, trying to maintain neutral expressions, while Pedro calmly described atrocities that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "I prefer the girls in Ecuador," he explained, his voice matter-of-fact. "They are more gentle and innocent. In Colombia, they are too experienced. But here, they still trust. They still believe." He described his quota, how he tried to kill 3 girls per week, how he'd select them based on specific criteria, how he'd perfect his approach until it became routine. The officers asked how many. How many girls had he killed? In Ecuador? More than 100, Pedro answered, as if discussing a sales target. In Peru, maybe 100 more. And Colombia, perhaps another 100. Maybe more. I lose count sometimes. The number was so staggering that the investigators initially didn't believe him. Over 300 murders? It was impossible. No one killed that many people. Serial killers didn't operate on that scale. The number was so large it defied comprehension, defied belief. This had to be exaggeration. This had to be the delusion of a man seeking attention or notoriety. But Pedro wasn't finished. He offered to show them, to take them to the burial sites, to prove he was telling the truth. The police assembled a team. They put Pedro in a vehicle and began what would become one of the most gruesome excursions in criminal investigation history. Pedro directed them through Ecuador's countryside, pointing out locations with the casual familiarity of someone giving a tour. "There's one buried near that tree, 3 more over that hill. Check by the river, you'll find several there." The teams began excavating, and they found bodies, dozens of them, small skeletons in shallow graves, some reduced to bones, others in various stages of decomposition. Each discovery confirmed another life stolen, another family destroyed, another child who died terrified and alone at the hands of this monster. The media descended like locusts. News of the arrests and discoveries spread across Ecuador, then South America, then globally. The monster of the Andes, the worst serial killer in documented history. Headlines screamed the numbers, each one more horrifying than the last. 300 victims, maybe more, mostly young girls, all brutally murdered. Ecuador was in shock. How had this happened? How had someone killed this many children without being caught sooner? The questions came fast and furious, directed at law enforcement, at government officials, at anyone who might be held accountable for this catastrophic failure. Because that's what it was, a failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. The excavations continued for weeks. Forensic teams worked in brutal conditions, uncovering remains from graves scattered across vast territories. Each body represented hours of painstaking work, of cataloging evidence, of trying to identify victims when many had been missing for years. Many families finally got answers, terrible answers, but answers nonetheless. Others remained in limbo, never knowing for certain if their missing daughters were among Pedro's victims or had met some other tragic fate. Pedro Lopez seemed to enjoy the attention. He gave interviews. He elaborated on his methods. He showed no remorse whatsoever. When asked if he felt bad about what he'd done, he responded with confusion, as if the question itself was absurd. "Why would I feel bad? They were just girls. Nobody important." That response, more than anything else, revealed the depth of his psychological damage. He genuinely didn't understand why murder was wrong. He'd been so thoroughly destroyed as a child, his empathy so completely eradicated, that he'd become something fundamentally disconnected from humanity. He understood that others viewed his actions as wrong, but only intellectually, the way someone might understand a rule in a foreign language without actually internalizing its meaning. Psychiatrists evaluated him, tried to understand the psychology that could produce such overwhelming violence. Their conclusions were complex and unsatisfying. Pedro wasn't insane in the legal sense. He knew right from wrong, knew his actions were illegal, but he was profoundly damaged. His childhood traumas had created a person entirely incapable of empathy, incapable of viewing others as fully human, capable only of seeing the world through the lens of predator and prey. Some experts compared him to a predatory animal, functioning, intelligent, but operating according to instincts that had been warped beyond recognition. Others argued he represented the absolute worst-case scenario of childhood abuse, the point where trauma becomes so severe that it doesn't create a damaged adult, but rather something that only resembles human on the surface. The trial was inevitable, but the legal complications were significant. Ecuador had abolished the death penalty. The maximum sentence available was 16 years, a laughably inadequate punishment for hundreds of murders. The prosecutors struggled with how to charge him. They settled on documenting 110 murders in Ecuador, though everyone believed the true number was higher. The cases in Peru and Colombia remained largely uninvestigated due to jurisdictional complications and lack of resources. The evidence was overwhelming. Pedro's confessions, the bodies he'd led authorities to, the testimony from attempted abduction victims who'd escaped, forensic evidence linking him to crime scenes. There was no question of guilt. The only question was sentencing. In 1983, Pedro Lopez was convicted of 110 murders and sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law. 16 years for 110 confirmed murders. Less than 2 months per victim. The families of the dead were devastated. The public was outraged, but the law was the law. Pedro would serve his time in a psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison, deemed too dangerous for general population and mentally ill enough to require specialized containment. He became a subject of study, a case file examined by researchers trying to understand the upper limits of human violence. He gave interviews to journalists, to authors, to anyone who wanted to peer into the mind of a monster. And through it all, he maintained his unsettling calm, his certainty that he'd done nothing truly wrong, his view that the world had taught him violence, and he'd simply learned the lesson better than most. "I am the man of the century," he told one interviewer. "No one will ever forget me." He was right about that, at least. Pedro Lopez had secured his place in history, not as anything admirable, but as proof of how thoroughly abuse can destroy a human being, and how that destroyed person can, in turn, destroy hundreds of others. The monster was caged, but the damage was done, and the questions remained. How many victims were never found? How many families never got answers? How many girls disappeared into Pedro Lopez's killing fields and were buried so well that their graves remain undiscovered to this day? The official count stopped at 110 confirmed murders in Ecuador, but Pedro had confessed to over 300. And nobody really believed he was exaggerating. Prison should have been the end of Pedro Lopez's story, should have been the place where justice, however inadequate, was finally served, where the monster spent the rest of his natural life contained, prevented from harming anyone else. That's how these stories are supposed to end, with the predator caged, the survivors attempting to heal, society processing the horror and implementing changes to prevent future tragedies. But Pedro Lopez's story doesn't end that way, because in 1998, after serving just 14 years of his 16-year sentence, Ecuador released him, let him walk out of custody as part of a legal technicality combined with good behavior credits. The families of his victims were never informed. No public notification system existed. One day Pedro Lopez was imprisoned for history's longest serial killing spree, and the next day he was simply gone. The public outcry was immediate and explosive. How could they release him? How could someone who'd murdered at least 110 children, who'd confessed to potentially 300 more, be allowed back into society? The explanations were bureaucratic and unsatisfying. Ecuador's maximum sentence was 16 years. He'd served his time. He'd demonstrated good behavior in the psychiatric facility. The law required his release. None of it made sense to anyone except the legal system itself. And even then, authorities seemed to recognize they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They deported him to Colombia, his birth country, figuring that removing him from Ecuador at least protected Ecuadorian citizens. Let him be Colombia's problem. Colombia wanted no part of it. When Pedro arrived, he was almost immediately arrested on an outstanding warrant, a separate murder charge from 1980 that had never been resolved. A woman's death that investigators had linked to him. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to another 20 years. Authorities breathed a sigh of relief. He'd be locked up until 2018 at least. He'd be in his 70s by then, presumably less dangerous. Presumably. But then things get murky. Very murky. The kind of murky that keeps criminologists and true crime researchers awake at night, checking and rechecking records that don't quite add up. In 2002, a Colombian court declared Pedro Lopez insane, ruled him mentally incompetent. And under Colombian law, the insane cannot be held in prison. They must be transferred to psychiatric institutions. So Pedro was moved, placed in a mental hospital in Bogota, supposedly secure, supposedly under watch. And then, nothing. The trail goes cold. The records become contradictory. Some sources claim he was released from the hospital in the late 1990s or early 2000s on a $50 bail for good behavior. A story so absurd it's almost impossible to believe, yet multiple sources report it. Others claim he escaped from the facility. Still others suggest he died there, though no death certificate has ever been produced. The truth is that nobody knows where Pedro Lopez is, or was, or whether he's even still alive. He simply vanished from official records sometime around 2002. Interpol issued a notice. His photo circulated through law enforcement agencies across South America. But no confirmed sightings, no arrests, no body discovered, nothing. He's a ghost, again, just like he was when he was hunting children across 3 countries. Invisible, untraceable, gone. This is where the story becomes truly terrifying for entirely new reasons. Because if Pedro Lopez is alive, and he'd only be in his mid-70s now, certainly old enough that his hunting days might be over but not so old that it's impossible, then he's been free for over 20 years. Free to do what? Free to go where? Has he killed again? Has he been living quietly somewhere? An old man with terrible secrets? Has he learned to control his urges, or has he simply gotten better at hiding bodies? The questions multiply in the darkness where facts should be. Did he return to the margins of society, that place where he always operated best? Did he leave South America entirely? Could he have crossed into Central America or Mexico, or even made it to the United States? Border security was lax in many regions. False documents weren't difficult to obtain. A man with decades of experience avoiding detection could easily reinvent himself. Or did something else happen? Did the police find him and quietly execute him, unwilling to let legal technicalities protect him again? Did vigilante justice catch up with him? A victim's family member recognizing him, taking matters into their own hands? Did he simply die of natural causes somewhere remote, his body never identified, his death never recorded? The uncertainty is maddening. For the families of his confirmed victims, it's torture. For law enforcement, it's embarrassment. For society, it's a failure so profound that it defies comprehension. The most prolific serial killer in documented history simply walked away from justice and disappeared. But let's examine what we do know. Let's piece together the fragments of information that exist about Pedro Lopez's final years in custody and the mysterious circumstances of his disappearance. The psychiatric facility where he was held in Bogota was not a maximum security prison. It was a hospital designed for treatment rather than punishment. The security protocols were less stringent. The monitoring was less constant. Staff rotations meant that not everyone was aware of who Pedro Lopez was or what he'd done. To some orderlies and nurses, he was just another patient. An old man with mental health issues. Nobody particularly dangerous looking. Pedro had always been good at blending in, at seeming harmless. It was part of what made him so successful as a predator. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like anybody, like nobody, a face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. And in the psychiatric hospital, he was surrounded by people who'd learned to see patients as diagnoses rather than as individuals. He was a case file, a medical problem, not a human catastrophe responsible for hundreds of deaths. Reports from other inmates, those few records that exist, suggest Pedro remained relatively cordial during his confinement. He participated in therapy sessions, though whether he was genuinely engaging or simply performing is impossible to know. He took prescribed medications. He followed routines. He gave authorities no reason to consider him an immediate escape risk because he wasn't acting like someone planning to flee. He was acting like someone who'd accepted his circumstances. But was it an act? Was Pedro Lopez, master manipulator, simply playing another role? Waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity? Or had he genuinely deteriorated mentally to the point where he no longer remembered what he'd done, no longer possessed the capacity to plan or scheme? The answers died with the institutional records that were either never properly maintained or have since been lost to bureaucratic incompetence. Colombia's record-keeping in the early 2000s was notoriously problematic, particularly in psychiatric facilities. Corruption was rampant. Staff were underpaid and overworked. The idea that someone could simply walk out or be released through administrative error or escape without triggering proper notifications isn't as far-fetched as it should be. Some researchers have attempted to track Pedro Lopez through circumstantial means. They've looked at unsolved murders of young girls in South America from 2002 onward, searching for patterns that might suggest his return to hunting. The analysis is complicated by the fact that violence against children remains tragically common throughout the region. Not every unsolved murder is connected. Not every pattern indicates a serial killer. Sometimes horror is just random, just the background noise of a world that still fails to protect its most vulnerable. But there are cases, clusters of disappearances in certain regions, young girls vanishing in circumstances that echo Pedro's historical methods. Nothing definitive, nothing that proves his involvement, but enough to make investigators wonder, enough to keep his name circulating in cold case divisions, enough to make parents grip their children a little tighter when strangers offer kindness. The psychological implications of Pedro's disappearance extend beyond the practical question of whether he's killed again. His vanishing act represents a failure of justice so complete that it undermines faith in the entire system. If someone who murdered over 100 confirmed victims can simply disappear from custody, what hope is there for accountability? For protection? For the social contract that says if you report crimes, if you cooperate with authorities, if you trust the system, then justice will be served. The families of Pedro's victims have been re-traumatized by his disappearance. They'd finally achieved something resembling closure. He was caught, tried, imprisoned. The nightmare was over. Their daughters were dead, but at least the monster was caged. And then that small comfort was ripped away. He was loose again, or dead without confirmation, or simply gone in a way that prevented any sense of resolution. Some families have hired private investigators, spent money they couldn't afford trying to track him down, chasing rumors and supposed sightings that inevitably lead nowhere. They've pressured governments for answers, for investigations, for anything that might provide certainty. But governments have moved on. New crises have emerged. Resources are limited. And an elderly serial killer who may or may not still be alive simply isn't a priority when there are fresh atrocities demanding attention. The true crime community has turned Pedro Lopez into something of a dark legend. His story appears in documentaries, podcasts, books, YouTube videos, each one examining the same fragmentary evidence, each one reaching similarly uncertain conclusions. Some portray him as the ultimate embodiment of evil. Others focus on the childhood abuse that created him, generating debates about responsibility and determinism. Still others fixate on his disappearance, spinning theories that range from plausible to conspiratorial. But beneath all the analysis and speculation, there's a simpler truth. Pedro Lopez murdered hundreds of children. He destroyed countless families. He exposed catastrophic failures in law enforcement, social services, and judicial systems across 3 countries. And then he disappeared, leaving only questions and trauma in his wake. If he's alive today, he's 77 years old. Statistically unlikely to still be actively killing, though not impossible. Serial killers typically age out of their most violent phases, though some continue in reduced capacity. His physical health would likely be declining. His ability to overpower and transport victims would be diminished. But his psychological drives, those don't necessarily fade with age. The compulsions that drove him to kill 3 children per week in his prime don't just evaporate because his body weakens. If he's dead, then justice was denied. Not the formal justice of imprisonment. He'd already served his laughably inadequate sentence, but the deeper justice of accounting, of knowing, of being able to point to a grave and say, "Here lies the monster, and he cannot hurt anyone else ever again." Families deserve that certainty. Society deserves that closure. The more probable scenario, according to most criminal psychologists and investigators, is that Pedro Lopez died sometime in the early 2000s, likely from natural causes or possibly from violence that was never officially documented. A man in his 50s or 60s, released into a society that knew what he'd done, would have faced enormous risks. Vigilante justice is common in South America. Prison gangs have long memories. Victims' families have permanent wounds. Someone could have recognized him, could have followed him, could have delivered their own version of justice in a way that authorities either couldn't detect or chose not to investigate too thoroughly. There's a certain narrative satisfaction to that possibility. The monster killed by the society he'd victimized. Poetic justice delivered outside courtroom walls. But it's also just speculation. Comforting fantasy, perhaps, for those who need to believe that evil eventually faces consequences even when systems fail. The alternative, that Pedro Lopez is alive, living somewhere under an assumed name, carrying his secrets into old age, is harder to accept but equally possible. He'd proven adept at disappearing before. He'd lived for years as a drifter, moving between countries, establishing no roots, leaving no trails. If anyone could vanish into South America's vast population and remain hidden, it would be someone with his experience. Some investigators point to the proliferation of informal settlements and remote communities where record-keeping is minimal and government presence is virtually non-existent. A person could live there indefinitely without documentation, without attracting attention, without ever appearing in any official system. If Pedro Lopez wanted to disappear, these marginal spaces would be exactly where he'd go, where he'd always thrived, where the forgotten live among the forgotten. Others suggest he may have suffered genuine cognitive decline, that the mental illness cited in his 2002 declaration wasn't strategic performance but actual deterioration. Decades of imprisonment, combined with whatever psychiatric medications he was prescribed, combined with natural aging, could have genuinely destroyed his mental faculties. He might be alive but no longer aware of who he is or what he did. Warehoused in some underfunded facility under a different name, his past lost in administrative chaos. The international law enforcement community has largely written Pedro Lopez off as a cold case. Interpol maintains his notice, but it's not actively investigated. Resources go to current threats, not decades-old mysteries about geriatric serial killers. The occasional journalist or documentary filmmaker will request information, chase down leads, interview people who claim to have seen him. But nothing substantial ever emerges. Just shadows and rumors and the unsettling reality that sometimes people just disappear. What we're left with is a horror story without an ending. A monster who killed with impunity, was briefly caught, and then slipped back into darkness. The confirmed victims, those 110 bodies excavated from Ecuadorian soil, represent only a fraction of the true devastation. The confessed 300 victims represent Pedro's own count, which might be exaggeration or might be understatement. And the real number, the actual total of lives destroyed, that's unknowable. Lost to time and terrain and the systematic devaluation of poor, indigenous, female children across South America. Those victims haunt the narrative, not as abstract statistics, but as individual lives cut short. 8-year-old girls who never became 9, 10-year-olds who never saw 11, children who had favorite foods and games and dreams, who laughed and cried and loved and lived until Pedro Lopez decided they shouldn't. Each one of them mattered. Each one deserved protection, investigation, justice. Each one was failed by systems that should have saved them. The families still search. Some of them, the ones who can afford to, who have the energy to keep pushing against bureaucratic indifference and governmental apathy. They form support groups, share information, keep pressure on authorities who'd rather forget. They refuse to let their daughters become footnotes, refuse to let Pedro Lopez's disappearance erase the fact that he existed, that he killed, that justice was never truly served. And somewhere, in a grave, in a forgotten corner of South America, in a psychiatric ward, in a remote village, or living under a new name in a crowded city, Pedro Lopez exists in some form. Dead or alive, aware or deteriorated, free or confined. The uncertainty itself is part of his final crime. The ultimate act of cruelty, not just murdering hundreds of children, but ensuring that even his end remains ambiguous, that even his absence creates suffering. This is how monsters sometimes win. Not through strength or cleverness or power, but through the simple fact that bureaucracies fail, that systems break down, that some questions never get answered because the people responsible for answering them are underpaid, overwhelmed, corrupt, or simply don't care enough. Pedro Lopez's story is a testament to that failure. A reminder that evil doesn't always get defeated by heroic investigators or courtroom justice. Sometimes evil just continues, unresolved, uncontained, unknown. And that's the most terrifying ending of all, because it means the story isn't over. It means somewhere in the back of every parent's mind in Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, anywhere Pedro Lopez might have traveled, there's a whisper of uncertainty, a voice that asks, what if he's still out there? What if the old man watching children in the park is him? What if the stranger offering help is him? What if the monster never died at all? Pedro Alonso Lopez murdered at least 110 children, possibly 300, possibly more. He confessed. He was caught. He was imprisoned. And then he vanished, leaving behind only corpses, trauma, and questions that will never be answered. Tonight, we descended into the story of the monster of the Andes. We examined his creation through abuse, his evolution into predator, his systematic destruction of hundreds of lives, and his final disappearance into the same darkness where he'd always operated. The monster hunted, the monster was caught, and then the monster disappeared. And somewhere, in the space between justice and chaos, Pedro Lopez remains, dead or alive, contained or free, known or forgotten. The nightmare continues, because some stories don't end. They just fade into uncertainty, leaving us with the terrible knowledge that evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs and claws. Sometimes it wears a human face, speaks soft words, offers candy to children who don't know better. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite our systems and laws and investigations, that evil simply walks away. This was the story of Pedro Lopez, the man who hunted children across 3 countries, the man who confessed to history's longest killing spree, the man who disappeared. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.